You better be listening to Sleazoids or I must break you.
This is the emergency broadcast system. We are under attack by conventional forces of the Russian army. It is believed the lead waves were disguised as commercial charter flights. Communications have broken down in other parts of the country. Large areas of the Midwest may have been overrun.
You're 40 miles behind enemy lines.
I just want to go home.
In Rocky IV, he fought for his country.
What the hell is this?
Now, Dolph Lundgren is taking off his gloves and taking on an entire army. One man at a time.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Sleazoids, the podcast where we go down the rabbit hole of 20th century genre fare from the most influential canon classics to the trashiest exploitation films we can get our hands on and invite you to tag along in helping us create a canon of sleaze. Each week is a double feature grindhouse style where we discuss two films loosely related by subject, genre, actor, filmmaker, or franchise, and at the end of each episode, along with our honorary Sleazoids, you can become by subscribing on Patreon.
Next week, we are covering some X-rated cartoon movies, apparently. So I don't know, we're going to see like Cat Hog or something. I don't know. Join the sleaze. It's going to be a lot of fun.
We decide on all the official ratings and rankings for every film that we cover. Patreon subscribers also get an honor shout out and 2 bonus episodes every single month, which we are in our 5th or 6th year. I can't do math. We have like 140 plus bonus episodes, as well as our bonus transmission series where we talk about new release genre films, which we have almost 50 of at this point. So patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast for everyone interested in that. And speaking of which, we do have some people to give their shout outs to this week. We had Tyler Kell sign up for $5 a month, Lionel Neves, Mackie, who signed up for $10 a month and will be joining us for the monthly virtual screening we do with those online patrons, usually the last Thursday of any given month. And we've been having some fun recently. We did like disturbing behavior, some 90s trash, as well as we might be leaning towards some Nick Cage. Actually, by the time people are listening to this, we might have already done some Nick Cage for the month, but we do one at the end of every month. Always fun. We also had Derek E. sign up, Caden sign up, Julian Kopkis, Matthew K., Jack Benura, and last but not least, Marcos Zenchata. So thanks so much to all of you folks for signing up. We appreciate the support. Hope you're enjoying all of those bonus episodes.
Yeah, thank you.
That's the one plug for the week. The other plug, as always, is Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you were listening on either one of those platforms, please give us a good old rating and review over on those apps. It helps us climb the rankings and find new listeners. And the very last plug for the week, as always, is merch. If you like the poster art that based out of Toronto horror artist Trevor Henderson did for our show, you can get that put on basically anything that you can think of. And you freaks thought of a lot of things. You've bought pens, you've bought pillows, you've bought hoodies, notebooks, just straight up posters for your place. That link is at in the description of this episode, as well as over at sleazoidspodcast.com. But that is it for the intro. Welcome back to another week. As always, I am your host, Josh Lewis, and joining me also, as always, my co-host,
Jamie Miller. Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome. I think 2 weeks ago would have been the last time you folks over on the main feed would have heard from us, and we would have been doing a massive maximalist double feature of June 1997 summer action blockbusters starring Nicolas Cage, both super successful at the box office with high concept screenplays so ridiculous they basically felt like parodies of late 80s, early 90s action style. That double feature was selected by our good friend Jason Buford, and the pairing was Jerry Bruckheimer and Simon West's knockoff Michael Bay, Tony Scott airplane prison break movie Con Air, and John Woo's glorious masterpiece of balletic destruction and the most acting maybe ever done in a movie, Face Off, with Nick Cage and John Travolta. We had a lot of fun breaking that down with Jason 2 weeks ago.
Oh, yeah. And really the only thing I have to add is Face Off is the best movie ever made. So thank you.
This has been Jamie's position for a very long time. This was a special Jamie episode that we got to do 2 weeks ago. So go back and check that out. And then last week over on the Patreon, exclusively for the patrons, we discussed in conjunction with the release of a brand new Christopher Nolan film called Oppenheimer. We discussed some Cold War nuclear Holocaust anxiety films as seen in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove from 1964, which took a look at the absurd, mutually assured destruction policies and realized them in both genuinely tense thriller logic and slapstick farce, basically simultaneously. And we paired that with Mick Jackson's Threads from 1984, which is a movie that tricks you into thinking you're watching a Ken Loach like kitchen sink BBC TV drama before changing gears to basically one of the most procedurally detailed and gruesome horror docudrama depictions ever put to screen, basically trying to show you what a nuclear winter might look and feel like on the ground level.
Yeah, it's truly horrifying stuff.
It's a ruin your night classic, and somehow 7 million people watch that live on broadcast television.
Yeah, they just keep trying to traumatize Britain. It seems they did it with Ghostwatch, and now then they did it with Threads. Or I guess Ghostwatch was after, but yeah, both these movies are fantastic. We had this funny thought by the end of it where there needs to be a super cut of the higher ups in Doctor Strangelove fucking everything up and having the bombs go off, and then you just cut to Threads as soon as the bomb does go off, and you switch gears entirely. But yeah,
because
one's
fantastic. Entirely in the strategic battle rooms, and the other one is entirely avoids that and sticks in completely to the on the ground sort of survival logistics.
Yeah, and so I want that super cut. It would be it would be very strange, but it's just that it ended up being such an interesting thing having those two kind of contrasting elements in both films back to back.
Hell yeah. So if you haven't heard that episode, again, patreon.com/Sleazoids podcast. That was last week's bonus episode. But moving on to this week, inspired directly by our time talking about the anti-war, sort of vaguely liberal-minded side of canonized Cold War cinema, we thought it only fair to also take a look at the other side of this equation in the form of some 80s Red Scare Rambo knockoffs made by legitimate right-wing hawks and psychos. We're going to be talking about John Milius's Red Dawn from 1984 and Joseph Zito's Red Scorpion from 1988 today. And it's an episode I kind of wanted to do for a little while. And, we thought who better to invite on to talk about that with us and break down some of the historical, political context these films came out in, what specific kind of anti-communist messages they were trying to send, and how effective they are at communicating them in their pulpy 1980s action movie styles. Then the two hosts of the Blowback podcast. Those guests are Brendan, James, and Noah Kulwin. Boys, how you doing?
Howdy. Let's
Hello.
go.
I am rocked. I am rock solid and ready to go.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I mean, both of you have been on before. We've had you on individually, but I know that I love your guys' show, number one. It's incredibly informative, incredibly well produced. I learned so much about American history and foreign policy every time I tuned into your guys' show. You've done seasons on Iraq War, the Cuban Revolution, the Korean War, and you have a brand new season coming August 25th, just a couple weeks away from people when people are going to be listening to this on Afghanistan. So when Brendan told me ahead of time that's what you guys were looking at doing for the new season, it immediately clicked in my brain. I was like, I've always wanted to do this pairing on our show. So it just kind of worked out that we were like, wow, you guys are already in that mindset, and now you're ready to talk about maybe two of the biggest anti-communist movies of the Afghanistan era, or at least in the American context of it.
Yeah, these are two heavy hitters. The 80s and Afghanistan, the Soviets in Afghanistan provided a very interesting sort of cultural payback. Not even to speak of the political payback on the part of the United States and Hollywood's ability to play the anti-imperialists for the first time, which was very much taken advantage of by.
They loved it. They were like, "Wow, we get to make our own Battle of Algiers every week." But
they wish, but
and in the case of Red Dawn, I mean, like it's like the first like conflict shots that you see in it are like all about Vietnam, in my view, and. I think that to Brendan's point about it being cultural payback, like it is, it was pretty crazy how a full decade and a half after the Vietnam War ended, they were still making movies about how upset they were for having lost Vietnam.
Oh yeah, Rambo went back and won that shit like 3 times.
That's right.
Retroactively. And we've talked about that on this show. We did the whole Rambo franchise around the time whenever the one where Rambo decided he was going to hang out on the Mexican border came out. Yeah. I don't remember when that was.
That's the canon history we acknowledge in our show.
Rambo Goes South is actually one of the more important blowback storylines that we're looking to develop and sharpen.
It's the Rambo and Metal Gear versions of history that we acknowledge in Blowback. We don't stick to the supposedly real world history that we all think happened.
We only accept Italian American history and Hideo Kojima history.
That's right.
Those are the only 2 histories. Anyway, I think we are going to jump right into it here. Let's get a little down and dirty. Let's talk about Red Dawn.
Because we live here.
Not bad for a bunch of kids, huh?
Mama'd be real proud.
All right,
can you make a movie with your penis never getting soft?
Stop it. Let them do the intro.
No, leave it in, Jamie. It's great. I love it.
Probably will, yeah.
All right, we are talking Red Dawn, the 1984 action thriller war drama written and directed by John Milius, co-written by Kevin Reynolds, the eventual director of such films as Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and Waterworld. 1984 is where I think I'm going to start this conversation out at, just because this is coming out at a time where most of the biggest films being made are pretty overt anti-war films. Like leading up to 1984, some of the big heavy hitters when I was looking into what was coming out and what was performing, The Big Red One by Sam Fuller, an adaptation of his own brutal World War II experiences liberating a concentration camp and photographing that, which gave us the horrendous image of Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker himself, witnessing a concentration camp, which kind of shocked people at the time in 1980 or 1981 when that came out. You've got Das Boot, which depicted the bleak sort of procedural mechanics inside of a Nazi U-boat. And of course, you have Rambo First Blood, which despite Stallone's change to the ending, is still a pretty obvious critique of turning a generation of men into, very ugly killing machines and then just dropping them back home. And then obviously the other one we did last week, 1984, is Threads, which is just, again, one of the most gruesome, undramatic, and bluntly horrifying movies about the effects of war on society and the future. Up there with something like Come and See, which would come out a year after Red Dawn. So there was a clear trend in the early 80s. Cold War anxieties were on people's minds. And even also if you had, the Rambo sequels and missing in action films, which would come out in the mid 80s onward, that would take us in a bit of another direction. It seemed Kevin Reynolds was more inspired by this sort of the trend that we were going into. And he wrote this script called 10 Soldiers, which he viewed as like an anti-war Lord of the Flies type thing, with a bunch of kids resorting to becoming guerrilla fighters and killers and essentially fighting amongst themselves and suffering psychological deterioration as a result of a Third World War that breaks out. And it was kind of meant to depict that, warmongering attitudes, actually contributed to some sort of form of self-destruction, which he viewed as a bad thing, and that it was hurting our kids. And, I think when he pitched it, and he originally pitched it to people like Spielberg and Walter Hill were directors who, flirted with the film, that he wanted it to be almost like a kids movie version of like The Deer Hunter or something. It was like an art studio war movie. That was his idea. Which I don't know if that would have worked.
Sofia Coppola's Deer Hunter.
Yes. But as it goes, MGM ended up buying the script for this film, and they wanted Walter Hill's very famous right-wing buddy and crank, director John Milius, who was hot off writing Apocalypse Now and directing Conan the Barbarian, and I think maybe even doing an uncredited draft of Temple of Doom, which I think a lot of people actually say maybe accounts for some of the ugliness that made its way into that script.
Supposedly, he did a pass on it.
And also I know Brendan had pointed this out to me, so I looked into it. Al Haig, former Nixon and Reagan crony, was on the board of directors of MGM.
Yes.
And was involved in the making of the movie and screened it and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, apparently he actually was the one who introduced, U.S. Army general and Reagan Nixon advisor was the one who introduced Milius to Herman Kahn as well. By having them do a meet at like the Hudson Institute conservative think tank or something like that, who is, for anyone who was listening last week, the insane physicist and military strategist whose mad rantings inspired Kubrick on Dr. Strangelove. So like this was like the child of Milius, the guy who inspired Dr. Strangelove, and a U.S. Army general all got a look at Kevin Reynolds' script and was like, well, what if instead of like a, kid deer hunter, it was like more like Kid Rambo 2, and we were like, the kids becoming mercenary commandos was instead of this like downer, which the movie still actually does have maintained some elements from, but what if it also was functioned as like a summer action movie about how them becoming soldiers is, actually kind of like a noble thing. We'll leave all the details where the kids die, but the tragedy of it will be more of in like the sentimental sense, in that like the kids are quite brave and heroic to become bloodthirsty revenge gun nuts who took a stand for their country in the face of annihilation.
Go ahead.
It's interesting just that that Hag even seemed to kind of scare Milius. Like Milius was taken aback by kind of the approach that he wanted to take.
Milius is a pretty smart guy. We've talked about some of his screenplays before, and I think even for him, the quote unquote plausible World War III situation they conceived of like a left wing Mexican and Nicaraguan government joining the Soviets and the Cubans to ground invade the United States to be and put them in the position of being a colonized force on the defensive, and then making the kids into like. Freedom fighters and stuff like that. Like to Milius, he was like, this seems like pretty ridiculous and kind of like a jingoistic fantasy and like a blatant call to arms. And he kind of knows from just knowing movie history that like, anti-war films are kind of the position. It's kind of what people go to for those movies. So.
Yeah.
Well, he said he viewed it as an anti-war movie. I think the quote was, I see this as an anti-war movie in the sense that if both sides could see this, maybe it wouldn't have to happen. I think it would be good for Americans to see what a war would be like. And I'm going to assume the precarious position of defending Red Dawn here.
Let's go. Let's get it started early.
Because look, there's a lot going on in it, and I guess the simplest way I could put it, as far as what we're talking about right now, with the general, with the guys on deck, with Haig and Kahn and then Milius, is that they were all right wingers, but not of the same type. And I think Milius is from that peck and paw, like Clint Eastwood tradition of being a right winger who is still generally anti-war, and or thinks of himself as anti-war. And when I was rewatching it, it felt like two movies. I really don't think that it is the fever dream of anti-communism that it has the reputation of, which is what I was saying to you last night, Josh, when I was rewatching it. I think that, especially if you're talking about a campy idea of that's really a movie like Joseph Zito, who did Red Scorpion, a movie like Invasion USA with Chuck Norris, in which it's basically a Red Dawn ripoff, a bunch of like a rainbow coalition of anti-American terrorists are deployed by the Soviet Union.
They're blowing up malls, and you have to get like a Florida man with Uzis to take them down.
I mean, the trailer is literally a family going inside for Christmas dinner, and then a Russian rolling up and blowing them away with an RPG, which is hilarious. That's what I think people. That's what I think people think of with Red Dawn. But I think that the first bit of the movie with the actual invasion is quite silly and silly, cynical, right wing. We can talk about that kind of stuff. And, the stuff of like the re-education camps and all that, it's a parody. But really the second half of the film, it's not pure, but it's really, I think, quite decent at preserving whatever Reynolds was trying to do, where you could really at that point substitute any malevolent occupier for the Soviets. There's really nothing going on about how the Russians are uniquely evil. And in fact, there's a speech Powers Booth gives we can talk about later that, sort of is the moment that is expressed. And it's just about what it's like to be a partisan, to be a guerrilla. It's bookended by kind of jingoism, but in the middle there, I don't really think Red Dawn is as crackpot in the heart of the movie as even some of the people involved with it probably wanted it to be.
Well,
we can talk about that.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think it was conceived in part to be a movie like that. And I think Milius has enough awareness and enough, I don't know if you want to call it shame to be like, I don't think that, like, I think he doesn't think that that's tasteful. I think that he actually comes from, as you were saying it, like a more traditionalist filmmaking background where he's just like, I don't think that, he's not the guy who could make the cartoon, crazy, unserious version of this, that it's kind of lived on in his people's minds, mostly because of the films that were directly inspired by it.
But also, the remake
is a little bit in there.
No, it is. And it's just interesting as I was watching it, because one thing I've always liked about, say, the movie, I think we talked about this on Blowback, The Guest, written by Simon Barrett and directed by Adam Wingard, right? Yeah, it's a great movie. Is that without declaring it or preaching it too much, that's a movie that during the War on Terror was basically saying, this is what it's like for a U.S. soldier to come into your, not an Afghan village, not an Iraqi town, but an American small town and wreak havoc. So it's not like, doing a pretentious liberal American thing where it's telling another country's story on that country's behalf. It's more just saying through genre filmmaking, like, how does this feel? This is pretty scary, right? And ironically enough, by using the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan, which is fair game, I guess, it's a real event, Milius was essentially doing that. And I think from his quote, that's what he was trying to get at, which is like, despite the silly anti-communist trappings in the beginning, he's really trying to say, wouldn't this be bad? Maybe we should not be in the business of doing this to other people, lest we, reap what we sow. And really putting you in the shoes of someone whose country is being occupied. So I think for odd political reasons and weird instincts that he has, he's kind of doing that. And that's more interesting than anything a lot of the copycats were doing.
Yeah, I think to me, one of the things that to me is particularly interesting about, I guess, the how to put it, like the kind of like holistic anti-communism of the movie, like the kind of like idea, like the moral ending, like what Brennan's been saying about how it's not really necessary or like you can dispense with it and you have this pretty core story about a group of kids in the middle of it. However, what I do really like is the kind of gestures that they do make and the like sort of limited world building that they do in sort of establishing for everybody. I guess that they're going to have this backdoor through Mexico and that it's the Soviets and the Cubans teaming up and sort of riffing. Like you do get a feel for like how a right wing guy would have like understood the world interlocking at that point in time. And that to me is like something that you don't see in a lot of movies. Like they don't give you enough information to actually get a feel for like how do all of the people, who are both making this and as characters in this, like actually have what is their worldview, broadly speaking.
Yeah, and there's actually some literacy about geopolitical reality at the time. In the middle of the movie, Powers Booth says 600 million, I won't say his exact words, but the Chinese are standing with the United States. And, at that point, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union were in some ways worse enemies than the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So, and you have to assume most people would have understood that the Chinese were also communists. So it really isn't painting with as broad a brush as, again, a lot of the copycat movies were, where communists are all the same thing.
You gotta love when a movie halfway through just introduces, Powers Booth, and he's the poetic fighter pilot who's like, the two toughest kids on the block. They were bound to fight. This was good.
Okay, that line I was going to bring up because I really like that line. It's
it's such a good line. It's such a good line.
Milius is a good writer, but really taking that line, like I said, as far as Milius is concerned, and that is in the kind of middle of the movie where it feels like Haig and whoever else was leaning on him to make it as high octane anti-communist as possible. That's they kind of got their rocks off in the beginning, and now it's settled into more of what maybe Milius and even Reynolds maybe was going for. That line, two toughest kids on the block. Sooner or later they're going to fight. It's not really assigning any deeper evil to the Soviets. It's just sort of saying it's being morally equivalent. It's saying, this whole Cold War is insane. Now, of course, from real world history, and as we discuss on our show, it is true that the United States was always the more aggressive of the two, but that is still a bit different than what I'm sure Alexander Haig was pushing for.
Yeah, Milius definitely comes into this with a little bit of a different approach, because I think most people know him for kind of like co-writing something like Dirty Harry, and a lot of people kind of view him that way. I mean, even Extreme Prejudice, which he wrote for Walter Hill, which is probably why Powers Booth ended up being involved in that one as well. He called that his right-wing Costa Gavras film, and and Walter Hill was the one who kind of rewrote it into being a little bit more of like a peck and paw Texas Ranger type thing. But Milius was also a guy whose beliefs he was like pretty open about. And he was like, I'm not a reactionary. I'm just a right-wing extremist so far beyond Christian identity that people can't even imagine. I'm so far beyond I'm a Maoist. I am a Zen anarchist.
Yeah. Which is all, that's really just word soup.
It totally is. And part of that is what makes me wish that, because he sounds like a pretty, you read interviews with him, you read other things that he's written. Sounds like a pretty unhinged kind of guy who has really bizarre beliefs that aren't entirely different sometimes than some of the guys that he was being asked to write for, like Alexander Haig and this. And part of it made me wish that, weirdly, this is not the first time we've actually discussed this premise on this show. There's this great Southern Baptist propaganda exploitation filmmaking duo named Estes Perkel and Ron Ormond, who did this incredible movie called If Footmen Tire You, What Will Horses Do? That basically envisioned in, I think, the early 70s, what Castro foot soldiers putting little American kids into education camps and killing their parents in front of them and torturing them in full graphic detail. And it was a film he actually shot on a very limited budget, and he basically took around the country screening in Southern churches in order to create panic in some of the parents and stuff. And it was such a paranoid, gross movie that so vividly and effectively captures that mindset and the yearning for this apocalyptic rebirth almost. That he hoped would scare kids into going to church again instead of watching cartoons and going to the drive-in. And when we talked about that, part of what we loved so much about it was that it was a perfect merging of an actual person who had pretty psychotic beliefs and a guy who was like a vaudeville magician who wanted to make horror movies. So his idea was to actually make a grindhouse movie where you watch Castro foot soldiers shove bamboo sticks through children's brains and things like that, and you watch it.
10-year-olds.
Yeah, it's really insane. And part of what kind of ends up being disappointing about Red Dawn for me, because I finally actually just watched it for the first time, only mostly having heard of its reputation. And I do agree with Brendan that it's definitely not as cartoony as the reputation that it has in the movies that it inspired. Yeah. And weirdly enough, part of my disappointment in the film was that I kind of was ready for the full, it's so sentimental and self-serious, despite how obviously silly the concept and it is. And I was just thinking about it, comparing it to something like the cinematographer who shot this film, Rick Waite, would go on to shoot like fucking Cobra, which is like one of the best fascist cartoon concepts turned into like stylish 80s action movies I've ever seen. When you have like, you know, Stallone drinking a Coors in the middle of like a gunfight, or the bad guy's lair with fucking like ritualistic battle axes and stuff. Like that's what the war on crime looks like to him. Or even speaking of war on crime, Death Wish 3, if you're talking like pulpy canon movie versions. Like one of the most openly fascist movies ever, but a total blast because it acknowledges that in order to justify its position on starting rocket launcher war in the streets against muggers, you kind of need to pump the gas. You need to Mad Max your universe a little bit, you know?
And also like in those, I mean, like Death Wish 3 is like, I mean, South Bronx looks like, you know, like heart of conflict, like Mogadishu. Like it's also 100%. There's a kind of like alienness that makes those like sort of grounds the surreality of those. Whereas like when you watch this, it's like, yeah, like Patrick Swayze and Charlie Sheen could be brothers, and like, you know, like the opening, like the first conversation they have in Red Dawn is about football. And like that you see, and like the turn of the movie could obviously be like basically right up until they go into high school class and you start seeing the history teacher give a lecture about the Mongols. That like, do you start, you know, seeing like, oh, wait a minute, something's up here. But like, you know, there is that like to me at least, like that artifice that helps those other movies like Cobra especially. You know, that helps you actually get immersed in them. With like Red Dawn, it's like, yeah, they're trying to have it both ways. Like they're trying to make it be this like incredible, like, I mean, for like a very like self-serious, dramatic, ponderous thing. Yeah, and then
kind of
also,
a respectable movie, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. And then also to be like, yeah, but like we're still gonna play. What was it? They played like an Eisenstein movie in the re-education.
Well, let's get to the world building. Let's get to the world building in a second. The last thing I want to say on Milius in particular, to your point, Noah, about having it both ways, is that I don't love citing Wikipedia, but it seems pretty straightforward here. He says it's off of that quote you said, Josh, where he says, I'm a Maoist, I'm an anarchist. He goes, any true, real right winger, if he goes far enough, hates all form of government, because government should be done to cattle and not human beings. The ultimate, anarchist or libertarian. Very next sentence, Milius has endorsed minimum wage laws and conscription. So it's like, okay, so you're the ultimate anarchist, except you think the government should be able to forcibly make you go fight a war, which you're apparently against, and you like minimum wage laws. So
normal anarchist,
who knows what he doesn't know what his deep down his politics.
Yeah,
are.
Like I said, normal anarchist.
Well, yeah, that's just it feels a little wishy-washy to me. Whereas
that's not his job, though. His job is not political theory. And I'll just say the last thing I wanted to quote here is protesters oppose the film to some degree. I don't know how many. And when they picketed outside of the MGM building, he said, quote, "What these people really don't like is that the movie shows violence being perpetrated against Russian and Cuban invaders, which is what the demonstration was all about. My question is, where were all these demonstrators when the Russians shot down that airliner?" Now, he's talking about a Korean passenger plane that we bring up in this season that's coming up, that the Soviets accidentally shot down, and that the United States went on to do a massive propaganda operation about trying to frame the Soviets as intentionally having shot down in cold blood a civilian aircraft. And so Milius is pretending like that was a Soviet op. And then he says, were they cheering about that? And what about the people being gassed and yellow rained in Afghanistan? We can talk about this in Red Scorpion too. We will talk about that. It was a major propaganda point that the U.S. government was pushing, and that it's very obliging activists for the freedom fighters, the Mujahideen, were pushing that the Soviets were using chemical warfare in Afghanistan, which we now know they did not.
And in fact, the year before Red Dawn comes out, the former head of chemical weapons inspection for the U.S. Army wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post saying there was no evidence of yellow rain use by the Soviets in Afghanistan. So it really was, by even the time this movie is getting made, it was known to have been a falsehood. This was the Iraq WMD of its time, in a sense.
So then, and then he says, but I'm also not right wing, so don't call me that. It's like he wants to make movies while being renegade enough to be a quote unquote right winger in Hollywood without actually ever seemingly picking a set of coherent ideological.
It's Hollywood. It's all Hollywood conservatives. It's just pick me girls. Like it's just pick me syndrome. Like they want to be.
Well, I think
that's what makes him different in his mind from like, oh, it makes me different from like George Lucas or Steven Spielberg, who are obviously all my peers.
And who like him, by the way. Like he can't be that right wing, or they wouldn't even want to be seen with him. Michael Winner, who directed Death Wish 3, is an actual fascist, and he's on the record saying that. And if you watch that movie, you can pick up on it.
Oh, no, yeah, he 100% commits and believes to all of that shit. Milius, again, I think part of his attraction to it, at least on a filmmaking sense, is definitely just the symbols of power with it, the strength of the image. Like, I think the other directed film we've talked about his on this show is Conan the Barbarian, which definitely has some, fascist subtext or text to it about the use of, force and strength in it. But the way that he accesses that as just like pure brooding tone and like really striking images of, Arnold being this massive, like painterly muscled body that can like decapitate magic snakes or like hurl James Earl Jones's decapitated head down a giant temple as a display of dominance in front of all of his followers. It has a certain power and weight to it that I think is what Milius is attracted to, and which was also left me a little surprised that I feel like when I was watching this film. And there's a full, and we'll get into it, especially in this opening here, which we should get into. I think that the opening is maybe the most weighted in terms of, really trying to paint on a massive scale and, really show you the, apocalyptic destruction and everything. I think that is kind of what he's attracted to. And it does surprise me that he ends up getting more low key. And part of it, I imagine, is like he wanted to go back to some of the anti-war sentiments of Reynolds' screenplay. But like the opening of this, when you just get like that iconic shot that is on the poster of all of the Soviets rolling in on, in the giant parachutes that they're coming down, and the way that it's revealed as like, the teacher is just like kind of like looking out the window, and it's just like a normal day, and you're only like 4 minutes into the movie. One of the main things I'll credit this movie with is that it gets to its premise really fast. It's a little long as a result because you feel like if it maybe had a half hour of build up to its moment, it wouldn't feel like it wouldn't get as monotonous by the time you're like an hour and a half into it. But man, this like opening of the quaint Colorado town, which is actually, I guess, like Las Vegas, and all of these guys just like rolling in and just massacring the teacher, massacring kids, cars crashing, squibs, rockets blowing up school buses, just kids' bodies littering the ground. That amazing pan from they can pry my gun from my cold dead fingers bumper sticker as a Russian soldier literally, does that to a corpse on the ground.
I mean, that's
what a sequence of events.
Getting in, because that first sequence is basically what I think a lot of people think the entire movie is.
Yes.
And
that's what I was expecting the rest of the movie to be like. Pretty much this first half an hour is what I was thinking it was going to be.
And I bet Milius enjoyed shooting it because he probably didn't have any soft spot for communism despite being anti-war. But that shot, I remember the one you just said, is fascist realism, where there's a bumper sticker of "You can pry my gun from my dead hands," and then it literally shows a Russian soldier prying a gun from a dead pair of hands. Like, I think that because there's really not a wealth of, and again, we've just talked about the nuances of Milius, so I'm not going to tar him, but this sequence is very much just pure kind of fashy, lowbrow entertainment, and there's really not a wealth of quality fascist high art or right-wing high art. The Futurists were an inspiration for the Italian fascists, not the other way around. And I'm currently reading Richard J. Evans's trilogy on the Third Reich, and the sections on culture, which was largely managed by Goebbels, are fascinating because essentially all the Nazis could do was kick people out of the art world, whether they were Jews or communists or sympathizers or liberals, whatever. So they just kept depriving themselves of quality artists and then just played Beethoven.
That's why we have an incredible German expressionist making noir
Correct.
films in Hollywood in the
Correct.
Into the 1940s and 50s.
Correct. Whereas, I guess they nabbed a talent with Leni Riefenstahl, but that was a fluke. So then as far as lowbrow art goes, like trash, there is some really amazing stuff, particularly the American reactionaries, because it's the ideal form of right-wing or fascist or, whatever you want to call it, art. It's hyper-literal and unapologetically hateful. And then in the case of Conan, homoerotic and just libidinal in its desire to glorify war and conquest, which just standing on its own, all of that is very entertaining stuff to watch. And
I also think that to Brandon's point, I think that literalism can lead, in the case of Red Dawn, to also like the odd moment of prophecy. For example, so the movie is set in their whole community, and the action takes place in Colorado. And Colorado is given in the plot a certain amount of significance because it's where the Strategic Air Command is. And they control, basically, like, of the nuclear triad, SAC controls 2/3 of it. Everything but the nukes on subs. And it's, it's where the Air Force Academy is also. It's really the kind of, like, spiritual nexus for, like, the American, like, nuclear frontier, let's call it. And I think it is also the place where, more or less, Columbine happened. And I do think that it is very interesting that, like, basically we do get a school shooting in a Colorado high school at the opening of this movie that would later go on to, that it would go on to inspire Tim McVeigh, at least according to, like reporters at the time said in the late 90s, who himself was the inspiration or the major inspiration for the Columbine shooting.
Wow.
So there is, to me, just like, like a kind of way in which it's like, to the extent that, like, I'm obviously not trying to be one of those guys who's like, well, it's just, it shows how art influences people, blah, 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 but make it so direct.
But there's something in this boring ass middle America that makes you want to shoot, just have a nice big war where you can finally just shoot some folks.
I mean, I think my theory is that, like, this is in the same way that, like, German fascism arose out of, like, this cultural discontent with the failure of German imperialism after World War I, like the affirmation of its failure. And then the humiliations of the Ruhr, and you had all these soldiers, the steel helmets, non-Nazis, but, an organized political force. Like, that's our fascism. We have this psycho-atomized American society. Like, our fascism, like, our Ernst Jünger is John Milius, Like, that's the hand that we're working with.
Well, let's go from the humiliations of the Ruhr to the scene where Charlie Sheen and Patrick Swayze are stockpiling Sprite and Cokes to live in the mountains.
It's incredible because a few of the boys escape, and we haven't mentioned it yet, but the cast, the God, Patrick Swayze, you also have
he's so good.
Yeah, you also have C. Thomas Howell, who never had much of an amazing career, but I do love him in that movie, The Hitcher, with Rutger Hauer. And both the year before were in Francis Ford Coppola's, like, gritty 80s update on 50s teen, like, Rebel Without a Cause, like, melodramas, The Outsiders, which both are pretty good in. And obviously you have Charlie Sheen playing Patrick Swayze's younger brother, Matt.
You have a very funny scene with Harry Dean Stanton.
Of course, pre-becoming an Oliver Stone regular in things like Platoon and Wall Street. You've also got Leah Thompson, who would go on to be in the Back to the Future movies, Jennifer Grey from Dirty Dancing, which would also have Patrick Swayze in it, and Ferris Bueller, of course, as well. And yeah, they obviously need to escape this, school massacre that just occurred out of nowhere in the middle of their school day. And Patrick Swayze is the graduated former quarterback who kind of becomes the surrogate dad or military general, named after Jedediah Smith. His name's Jed. And he's the one who takes Matt, Charlie Sheen, and Robert, C. Thomas Howell, and Daryl and a bunch of the other ones. They load up on Coca-Cola and Sprite from Robert's dad's general store, who was eventually killed for doing that, deemed at a gesture of aiding the guerrillas. They get a handgun from the glove compartment and take off to survive in the cold wilderness and live off the natural land and the preserved forests of Colorado. And my only real kind of issue because I actually think that the opening has a strange, sort of, again, as Brendan was putting it, like a fashy power to it. And what it does kind of trigger, though, is that I found that a lot of the action was kind of a strong commitment to massive practical destruction. Mm-hmm. You gotta love it every time you see it in a movie like this. A lot of this was real military equipment. A lot of it was really blown the fuck up, but it is kind of weirdly clumsily constructed and kind of flatly shot. There's not much tension or like character psychology baked into the set pieces or anything. It's very expensive. Which is it kind of relies on its way to do it, and it kind of, that element of it kind of funnels its way even through the survival stuff, where it's, it doesn't feel like it has a lot of controlled pacing to it. It feels a little thinly sketched, especially in terms of like the personalities of the characters and what they're actually fighting about, because I imagine they were maybe fighting about more complicated things amongst one another, maybe in Reynolds' script, and they needed to cut some stuff. I know Powers Booth claims that, because he actually was supposed to be a straight up anti-war character who was supposed to teach the kids otherwise, and that he was told that was why he signed on to the movie, and all of that was cut. So that might be an element of it as well, but it's a little stiff as it lurches from the various scenes of them like going hunting and like drinking deer blood, which is like actually kind of a cool scene. If I think someone would have maybe directed it to really get into that like base primal instinct of the violence these kids are going to be doing. When
I saw that scene, I actually thought that they were like pranking him for a minute. I feel like they didn't set it up entirely properly to give you this feeling.
Oh, Jamie, you will love to hear that that's what they do in the remake. In the 2012 remake, that scene is turned into the two kids just prank him, and they're like, "We didn't drink any fucking blood, you fucking idiot." Okay,
because that's what just the way that it's paced towards the final part of that scene where they're like, I can't remember exactly what they say, but essentially it's just like that you have the warrior spirit now. You're like, you're one.
You need to like be respectful of the of this like connection we have with our hunting forefathers and like our pioneering heritage and like this kind of thing.
And I think that goes into the whole the strange tones that this carries. Like we were saying, the first. I mean, I guess this is still kind of in the first 30 minutes or 45 minutes or so, but there is kind of a cartoonish quality to how the communists come in and all of that, and then it just gets so incredibly serious. And this is one of those moments where I was like, okay, are we still in the first kind of more fun 20 minutes of this film?
No, this is a scene from Reynolds' version of kiddie porn, war porn, The Deer Hunter.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's moments in this film like this one where I just can't quite see, I guess, until the end of the scene. You could
imagine someone using it more poetically, I think, than it ends up being squished between scenes of them like hanging in the rural farmhouse where they're picking up the teen girls being hidden under the floorboards like Jews in the Second World War, spying on their new communist overlords who have like stolen their cars and homes and businesses and are just like driving around in the mayor's car, like burning books like in the car and stuff.
When he pops open the trap door and Jennifer Grey and what's her name? Thompson.
Leah Thompson.
Leah Thompson pop out. I let out a big laugh. I was like, oh wow, okay. They're just down there. I mean, there's no one around right now. Why, sure, when the Soviets come around, pop them in there. But why are they constantly being shoved in the trap door?
No, this is definitely the most like cartoony stuff with the they're putting up their Lenin posters. They're apparently as Noah was pointing out, they're giving out free all day repertory screenings of Sergei Eisenstein films, which you can actually see in the marquee in the back.
I was like, that sounds pretty good. At the camp too, or something like that.
Yeah, they're playing it at the camp, but they're also offering free screenings, and it's just like, oh no, the horrible cultural policy of free high art. That would be terrible
for everyone.
Also, it's like cutesy in the beginning where I assume this is intentional, where the Wolverines, the home team, who become which becomes the moniker of the.
It's so funny that they're wearing like leather jackets under their like camo gear and stuff like that. They're like Wolverines, go Wolverines, as they're like killing people.
And it becomes the 5-person guerrilla army that is single-handedly taking on the Soviet army. The away team is the Grizzlies. So you see, the Russians are invading, and there's posters around before they even get there called "Let's beat the Grizzlies," i.e., I have to assume the Russian Bears is what they're going for there, which is pretty funny. I thought it was mildly cynical in the beginning when the first victim of the invasion is the black teacher. As if it's the USSR and communists that hold the legacy of anti-black violence of the 20th century. I thought that was a pretty cynical way to get people, because there's this like kind of. It's not dissimilar to what's weaponized today, where it's like, hey, when it comes to the foreigners, we're all one family in America, like, can you believe how racist these Russians are and it's like, if anything, there's actually quite an interesting history of, black intellectuals and activists traveling to the Soviet Union and realizing just quite how poisonous American racism is. So the right wingers got to just nip it in the bud right away that, nope, it's not complicated. The Russians are evil, and the first person they shoot is our black teacher in Colorado. It's a certain touch to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what it's so. It does feel so weird to just for me to include such insane details like this, like such an extreme Orwellian vision of like conservative paranoia, and then just also be like, well, now we're going to transition into some kind of flat, obvious melodrama. Like, I was actually more with the movie during scenes like Harry Dean Stanton in a concentration camp for badass NRA American dads screaming, "Avenge me!
Avenge me!"
That comes out of, again, this is like the schizophrenia of the movie. It comes out of nowhere. Like, it's such, he's one of my favorite actors. It's such a restrained scene where he's just like, just because I beat your ass for 18 years.
It's like fucking literally like the most like, it's like having, I don't know, like a Kubrick interpretation of like a Bircher pamphlet. It's crazy. I love it.
But he's so restrained, and then like, it's hammy and all that.
And then he's just not,
And then all of a sudden he's like, no, get out of here. Don't let them find you. And then after having said, sneak away, don't let them find you, he screams directly at them, "Avenge me," so that every camp guard can hear it. It's just so, it's bizarre.
This is also
the movie has a schizophrenic approach to combining these two things.
No, this is what we're talking about with Milius,
And this is also after he tells them like to calm down, to not cry anymore. It's like there's no
dude. Don't cry is definitely the most like I thought was like that was like one of those things where it's like you're like showing your hand a little too much here, because that is like the you want to be like the perfect like subject, you want to like because like really like that is the kind of thing you say to people if you want to psych them up over time to like be able to get into the mindset where they can just herd people into the gas chamber. Like that to me was the.
Well, I think that's interesting though. I mean, I actually thought that was one of the better through lines is Swayze's, because he cries when he has to execute. Is it his own brother? No, that's Charlie Sheen. It's one of the
friend.
others. His friend.
It's the class president.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So he executes them, or rather, he almost does, and then the really dead-eyed kid whose dad was killed does it for him. But and then he cries like he later on in private. There's that's the more interesting stuff about how. Along with the Powers Booth, and I want to talk about the Cuban Comandante stuff. That's the stuff about how it's not so easy to convince yourself to be just a badass killer all the time.
I mean, but it's like,
and if you do, you might become a cold-blooded maniac.
This goes back to the both ways things, right? Because it's just like, to me, it's like, okay, then if you're making a movie about the futility of war, which is what he and Al Haig, like, it's what they all agreed on as like the message of this is. Then it's like, okay, great. Then why the fuck are you making a war movie with a bunch of awesome protagonists who are played by beautiful Hollywood
exactly,
people?
Exactly. I'm admitting that about how this is two movies, but the movie underneath the Alexander
and they
Haig
sneak
movie is
in
more
because
interesting.
I mean, to your point too, Brenton. I also think that because I think that stuff's in there as well. There's also a couple times where they deliberately play it to a little bit more of a grosser degree because there is this there is a lot of crying and moping in terms of the tone of the movie to the kids who are watching their parents being put in camps, watching their parents get executed, and being handed all of this responsibility to defend their country. And there's actually one really moment that I actually found on a more toned down way a little gross, which was the one when Patrick Swayze is holding one of the kids and he's saying, "Don't cry, hold it back.
Turn it into something else.
Turn it into something else. Never cry as long as you live." And you also have Robert come in and say, clearly they're going to kill us. So why should we be any different? And it actually kind of lets that hang in the air instead of actually, because later there's a part where they go to execute the kid and it's actually, it feels bad. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like something we should be doing. But in the early goings,
but that's good because at first it is all fun. It's all a slogan. It's all like, no, don't worry, we're going to get him. But then when you're really staring down the eyes of a traitor, you don't really want to follow through. I had no problem with that at all. I liked the line.
And it's up to the 1,000-yard stare guy to actually pull the trigger.
Well, that's how this shit works.
Well,
I'm totally fine with all that.
I mean, the thing though, the scene that most fucked with me though is the sort of making of the 1,000-yard stare kid is when they make him drink the blood, and I hate that scene for a number of reasons. I mean, to me, I find most hunting, as a coastal Jew, I find most hunting to be alienating and deeply bizarre if you're not doing it to feed yourself. However, this thing where he the kid who looks to me like a kind of almost like young Anthony Perkins. He does look like to me, I just thought it was I'm seeing Norman Bates being molded by his mother here, except it's Patrick Swayze and Charlie Sheen. And, he says well, I'm inspired by, I learned how to do everything because of,
Jedediah Smith.
Yeah, Jedediah Springfield and Jim Bridger. And, there's this kind of again, this was this German Volkish fascism, this kind of idea of, I get this mythos of the land as a kind of purity that's gonna so there's this
but
it's
isn't
like a
that
dumb
honest?
fucking.
But isn't that honest to what Milius is actually into? I mean, I'd rather see it where I like him where I can see him.
Part of why I guess to me that scene rubs me the wrong way is I guess because it's it does just feel okay, but why the fuck? This is in a Bass Pro Shop. The context feels so wrong. This isn't a fable. This isn't a myth. This is to me
it kind of is a fable and a myth, right? I mean,
yeah, that's fair. It's
how the fuck did these Cubans
honestly,
get past the
if I'm really
border?
taking inventory here, if I'm really looking inward and being all right, what is my frustration with this scene? It's literally why the fuck are you drinking blood? That'll kill you. That's so unsanitary.
Well, that's your hang up.
It's not my hang up. I think it's my I'm on guard.
Yeah. I think
I think Brendan's right in the sense that that would be the more interesting movie if that was the movie they made the whole time, and that's not the movie that they made the whole time because they will cut to that scene to spending time with some cartoon Russians doing evil mustache twirling dominance and raiding gun stores, gun stores for lists of who does private purchases and raiding the local politicians and sort of wealthy people for lists of the bad behaving children, and the also that fucking scene where they take selfies in front of the National Forest sign talking about the Forest Service Act preservation of trees.
That is what Americans do when we do when we're doing occupations and stuff. I actually thought that when I was watching, I was you know what, this is like the military consultants who they brought in to tell them so here's what an occupation would look like. They're just describing from experience. So take that's how to view it.
This is exactly, and we mentioned this in the intro. This is exactly what I mean. Because, and this goes for Red Scorpion, but even more for Red Dawn, because essentially it is stealing valor from actual communist history of partisan fighters. It's America never got to do that. Americans never, even the French Resistance, there's the mythology of the French, and I just watched Army of Shadows the other day.
Our good war, Union Victory, was asserting state authority.
Right. So it cannot
Army of Shadows is amazing movie.
Army of Shadows is amazing. It cannot be overstated how much the Afghan invasion was viewed as payback for all the years the U.S. was the invader, the occupier, the imperialist, not just in Vietnam, but as we all know, we could rattle off most of the world. And we talk in the show about how this was explicitly cooked up, this narrative of Russia's Vietnam, by American intelligence and propagandists, when in fact, in some ways that makes sense. In other ways, things were quite different. But in Hollywood too, it gave guys like Zito, or to a degree Milius, or his handlers at least, or Stallone, carte blanche to finally play the anti-imperialist, the American partisans, to do the heroic guerrilla stuff that the Cubans always got to do.
Oh yeah,
and
like hiding underneath the rocks below while they have the one Soviet guy like reading the sign and reading it incorrectly, being like, this is not the site of like an American forestry act, but an indigenous peasant uprising where Roosevelt and his army of cowboys squashed them all.
But you know what I'm saying? Where that was always everyone knew that was always the territory of the Soviet partisans in World War II, of the French resistance, of the Cubans. It never got to be the Americans. We had to do movies about how we're so guilty about Vietnam, or about how our guy got left behind, or about how he has PTSD. But now finally we can be the Cuban rebels, or we can be the anti-communists again in the uprisings. Even in Predator, far superior action movie, though it's very cursory to the plot. The reason Arnold and company go in to their mission where they meet the Predator is that the Soviets are killing, I don't know, the brave Contra death squads camping out in Colombia at that time, whatever the justification was. But they were constantly trying, with the Soviet invasion, they could finally say, okay, the roles are switched now. And that's what this movie is really celebrating. Like at the end where everyone kind of dies. I guess Jennifer Grey, wait, no, she dies. Leah Thompson.
The one
most of them die.
Wait, question. The girl who lives though, and who was like nonverbal for most of the movie. She is, maybe because she's nonverbal, this is just my association, but I'm gonna be honest, it was giving me what's her face from Aliens, the kid.
Newt? Well, it's Leah Thompson. It's the Back to the Future and Caroline in the City. She's like, she became. At first, I went, "Holy shit, is that Leah Thompson?" I forgot that she was in this. Anyway, it's a classic martyrdom story that was always the domain usually of left wing fighters. And I'm just trying to say, I think ironically enough, it is literally just switching out either American or German armies for the thing that never happened, which was that our troops were fighting Soviet occupiers, and that never would happen. I mean, it's also pretty funny. I said that this was kind of geopolitically literate in some ways, but it's also pretty funny to just hear the explanation of how this invasion force even broached.
Like, it's literally, I imagine Milius talking about it like it's, like in like a Walter Sobchak kind of voice. Like it's like, well, there's a center-left government in Mexico that right opens up the belly right up the middle of America. And then, we got a front along the Continental Divide. And it's like, you sound like a crazy person.
Well, that's Alexander Haig apparently was the one who said that. He said that there should be a Mexican revolution so that they let in. And they say mostly illegals coming from Mexico.
That is also, by the way, like one of the things that you're actually something that occurred to me while I was watching it, which is that like these kinds of movies are very useful as exercises in sort of spelling out the fantasies that a lot of conservatives in, actual politics have to leave unspoken because they're fantasies, and they are the fantasies that drive them. If narratives are at the core, and as I believe, of why people believe most of what they believe, in the case of the conservative, like the deformed fantasies that make up the stories that conservatives tell themselves, like this is, I guess, like a lot of that getting laid out on the table, not just in the kind of like like lust for martyrdom that these people like have in their minds, if not actually doing themselves. You do get like this, sort of a sense of like, how it's like, well, this is the thing that we've been waiting to happen. This is our version of like a Threads or the day after.
Yeah, it's creating a situation,
like Mujahideen.
Right?
Like they're literally.
Exactly. No, it's
Dude,
which is such a
Patrick
crazy.
Swayze's got the Mujahideen cap. It rocks.
Yeah, like that's such a crazy thing to conceive of. Is like, what if kids like the all-American football quarterback was actually a Mujahideen fighter, and creating a context in which that could happen is basically,
awesome.
Again, how the movie was conceived, and talking about like how good it kind of felt to execute a Russian who was doing like awful things, to you, because they were doing it to our parents and putting them on wheat field firing lines, and so like the movie at a certain point, you imagine that, and I do think the better version is probably the one that, again, leans more into what Reynolds was looking for, which was that, it was actually going to care more about this, because like some of it is still in here, but the transformation that these kids actually do into something that's really horribly ugly. But this movie seems more interested in how they make that transformation and actually become kind of useful to the vision of bloodthirsty revenge in terms of foreign policy, and also, these guys actually wanted them to be. Like when they do their student uprisings, it's not an ugly thing. It's like a quirky Spielberg, almost like the kids are fighting back against the bullies is kind of tonally how it plays like, despite the fact that you have Milius's commitment to the practical destruction and the blood mist of it and stuff. But that it's just weird. The movie, maybe because of some of how it's not particularly incredibly directed in terms of like suspense, and maybe there should have been some more horror ugliness to the action or something, but it's just like if that's what the movie, and I think what Brendan is kind of arguing is that it is about this Reynolds transformation that he had in his screenplay to these kids realizing that this killing is kind of ugly and kind of bad, which there are elements kept of that. It's just it really does feel like it doesn't commit enough to that. It becomes more fun to watch them scream Wolverines and like so much flip a truck over or something.
I said to Noah, like, if you really wanted to follow the analogy that they're pursuing to its rightful conclusion, I mean, there would be a scene where Charlie Sheen is in the mountains skinning a Russian alive and doing, let's say, untoward things to him sexually, which is what the commanders of the Mujahideen we funded were doing to Russians in Afghanistan. That was not going to ever be on the screen ever. So you kind of have to, as we keep saying, split the difference in this unsatisfying way.
We haven't mentioned, though, is that, like, what sort of is, though, provided as, like, the fuel for this transformation and what, like, justifies, so Sheen before, like, the final, like, the climactic martyrdom scene at the end where they go to meet, where they say the Shahada and go to meet Allah. The Charlie Sheen says to Mute Girl, like, like Jed and I, we can't go with you. We're all spent up. And part of like the reason that is supposed to seem as credible to the viewer is because we've also seen by now like 2 or 3 different rounds of like the Soviets just like indiscriminately killing civilians. Yep. Which are massacres that are witnessed by the Wolverines, by the partisans.
Yes, while also being, what is a Wolverine? It is a small animal like a badger, but terribly ferocious.
No, but like that's Milius, though. This is where it's like Milius is really fucking annoying to me because he just steals stuff and then says he's doing homage. So like, for example, that scene where they're all around like the radio and it's going around, like that's just The Longest Day, and then it plays that fucking like glory hallelujah. They play a military march on the propaganda radio after doing like the coded message thing, which is like insane to me. Like, think about this. Like, you're America. You have the richest cultural tradition going of any country in the world because you're Rome. You're we've got everything.
Well, I don't know about
and
that.
What do we play? No, I'm just saying. I'm being hyperbolic here. Yeah. Like, you've got people behind enemy lines, and what do you broadcast to soothe their nerves at the end of it? Like fucking John Philip Sousa. Anyway. Yeah.
Also, it should have been Little Richard ultimately.
Well, they did that in Red
so
Scorpion.
That's the point, that when he has these Soviet generals giving these lectures about the animals,
should have been Twist and Shout.
He's doing a version of Z. Where it's the beginning of that movie where he
loves Costa Gavras, we know that
exactly, because he really talks about Costa Gavras all the time, like where it's a lecture about plants and defoliants, and so he's also again like he's I think like to my mind just got like this like really crazy and incoherent palette. He's like no feel for describing what the Soviets and Cubans should be like, so it's full cartoonish.
I disagree.
Like, the place where he's supposed to, in the place where there's supposed to be legible characters and traumas, instead we just have like these crazy cartoonish things that then are like used as the things that deaden the souls of Sheen and Swayze and force them to commit these atrocities.
Okay, but it's Red Dawn. So, I mean, it's Red Dawn. So I wasn't expecting first time I saw it or this time that there was going to be anything other than something 3 notches away from parody. But I do want to say the last thing I have to bring up really is I thought it was more interesting and more nuanced than I was expecting. The subplot with the Cuban Comandante, played by Ron O'Neill, I think his name is, the actor.
Yes.
And what's interesting there, I mean, the Soviet KGB guy is literally a mustache twirling villain.
Oh, and you're saying that the amorous Latin military officer is not a stereotype?
Well, I'm not saying he's not a stereotype. I'm saying that they cast the Russians, ironically enough, as we've just said, because the Russians were actually the partisans in World War II that they're ripping off in this movie. But they cast the Russians as out of touch, cold, calculating police state guys, and that the Cuban is the one who is in touch with his recent revolutionary history, and he says out loud, he says, like, I was a partisan not so long ago. Like, I'm telling you, you big wigs, in your ivory tower, that we're going to create a guerrilla insurgency if we don't change how we're doing things. And at the end of the movie, quite in contrast to Red Scorpion, which we can talk about, he is like somewhat of a character who's saying, like, this isn't for me. I've become an occupier and I don't want to be, and I'm going back to you. I'm going to resign. And then, of course, he lets Charlie Sheen and Patrick Swayze leave because he realizes, I was you once in a different context. And
game respect game.
Politically, that's all nonsense. But in the narrative of the story, I think it was more than I was expecting. And again, something that could have been, if this movie was a little bit more legit as far as trying to tell.
Yeah, they could have expanded on that. They definitely could have left the stuff in about Powers Booth's character. I do like his line, all this hate's going to burn you kids up.
Now, that's interesting too, right?
See Thomas Howell being like, keeps me warm,
Yeah, that's a good exchange, because he's saying, you're becoming a psycho, basically. It's not saying that it's good to hate. I mean, that's again. Then you got all the jingoisms, so it's all undermined. But again, these are two different instincts in the same movie.
Yeah,
which is what I find
because I think Noah does have a point about just like the situation as a result, because it's being so cartoony and being the thing that is inspiring them to have this more sort of somber reaction is maybe what makes the somber reaction not play as strongly as it should. Because I think Brendan has a point that, like, that stuff is probably what it was originally supposed to be like, and I think Milius doesn't handle it like terribly or anything, but for me it just still doesn't work. Like I wish it worked better than it does.
Well, I mean, Milius just clearly, like, he doesn't, like, I think part of it is that, and this is probably the last thing I have to say about this one, but like, he cares about the Americans more than he cares about the Soviet or Cuban characters. But like the lack of seriousness in trying to assign them an evil, the fact that the 2 examples he did give publicly were both bullshit. Like, there's
true.
Like when you look at the last scene, right, when Swayze and Sheen die, the astute viewer will notice that it is happening on a bench next to a swing set, which is the like one character detail about their histories, aside from that they both play football, that we get in their conversation with their dad. When their dad, it's like John Milius's, you think it's John Milius's attempt, like, feeble attempt at writing, color for, male, like family bonding, that like is like, remember when I used to push you on the swing set? And then, it goes on like, holy cow, the brothers are bleeding. Damn, they're bleeding out on a bench right next to the swing set. Yeah, and it's like, nice. Cool. That's interesting. It's poetic. However, it's like, what is that in context to? Like, literally, the last dialogue that happens before the set piece is this Cuban, guy saying, writing to his wife, like, I'm going to announce my resignation. And it's like, what is he's just like? He's like, I just want, like, it's just like the most, like, to me, like, very contrived, like, horny Latin man stuff. Like,
the sentimentalist valor of the film does not end up really working.
Bingo. And like that's where to me it just kind of got to this thing of like, okay, like I would be able to appreciate like the poetry or whatever of like having these characters with like, their fanatics resolution here if it wasn't
and that kid hanging over the tank barrel having just been shot in like that winter cavalry set piece, which is one of the stronger ones actually, when they all learn horse riding, very American West of them.
Like it's part of is like, like it's just the emotional beat. Like if I'm to explain why it is that like some of the genuine emotional or even more sophisticated emotional beats of this movie don't land, it's because like, well, what their counterweight is like, like literally like John Bircher stuff that like, that minor James Elroy characters would like read on the toilet.
Also, it is silly that there's literally 5 kids, and that's the guerrilla army. I couldn't shake that. I'm like, and also it's like the same 2 commanders from the Soviet side. William Smith, I think is his name. He's in a lot of garbage, but he's kind of good.
Oh, and Brian James.
No, he's in Red Scorpion. You're thinking of Red Scorpion.
Fuck.
That's right.
Are you thinking of the guy that's in Blade Runner? Is that what you were thinking of?
That's what he's thinking of.
I was almost about to do the same thing.
I'm just talking. I'm talking about the guy who has the mustache who says it was bad to take revenge on civilians. We need to just find the Wolverines. Mm-hmm. He has that cool kind of very Z-like sequence, as Noah said, where he's reviewing the military strategy, and he gets killed by Patrick Swayze at the end. He's like the final boss.
That scene made me wish that John Milius at some point in his career actually got to make like his version of like Battle of Algiers. It literally reminded me of that opening when he comes out. He's like, I'm the Spetsnaz hunter.
But that's a great scene when that guy dies is like an amazing example though of his limitations as a director, because like how is that standoff? Basically, we're just waiting for a train to pass, and then he walks past the rail, and what's this? Patrick Swayze says something to draw his attention as he kills him, and they shoot each other. And it's like this incredibly, I found a very like unsatisfying death for Swayze, and like a bad, say what you will about the Battle of Algiers, dude. At least it was like fucking Italian neo-realist, like cinema, like whatever.
It looks amazing. It's amazing.
Well, that guy should have been the villain the whole time. Like they kind of didn't pick a villain.
Yeah,
like
make the Spetsnaz super soldier the bad guy,
you weren't sure if the Cuban was supposed to be somebody you were secretly rooting for or not, because he's given like good guy stuff and bad guy stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's his attempt at nuance. But yeah, there's the KGB like snidely Whiplash looking guy, but he just gets blown up at the end. He never really rises to like confront the heroes. The Spetsnaz guy.
No, the action scenes are lacking, which is what did surprise me. Like Milius, I mean, again, I liked a lot of the action scenes in Conan, so I don't know. There was something weird about this, and especially when we'll talk about it when we get to Red Scorpion. But like Joseph Zito, in terms of like just constructing shots and constructing tension and actually putting beats where a character has to make a decision or go on some sort of physical mission. Like how was there no like procedural element at all? Like these are kids doing crazy missions, and it's like, how does it just feel like, again, it's like students just like flipping their desks over and like raiding a classroom or something? Like that's the extent to how it depicts this. There's no variation to the set pieces. There's no, and it does affect the movie that by the time you get to the big bad guys being murdered, you don't feel anything. You're not like, I don't even get the catharsis that you think the movie is supposed to be giving you, because it doesn't, give you any kind of tension or strategy, or it's just, it's striking and counter striking. Where is Rambo setting up his traps and then seeing people die like in slasher sequences or something?
Like what is the command outpost they've been working toward the whole time, and now they're finally there, and this is the Death Star. I agree. All right.
Yeah. So as you get into the final half hour, and that's all the movie is, and you're not even feeling the catharsis of their martyrdom because it's not even indulging in it. I don't know. It doesn't work.
Let's be positive before we end on death. On what's it called? Red Dawn.
Red Dawn. Brendan's favorite movie, by the way.
My favorite movie. Apparently, Milius
favorite director.
Apparently, Milius didn't even really like it. So
no, I enjoyed it. I was happy to have watched it.
So what is everyone's favorite scene? My favorite was the execution scene because I think it's pretty good dialogue. It's got that great moment where he's like, we need to execute him. which, if you watch Army of Shadows, it's arguably a little bit better done in that movie, but it's a thing in resistance movements that you can't accept traitors, so it's a real problem. And it pits our protagonists against each other, and it's tense. And then there's I think pretty good line about what it means to be in that line of work, which is they go, Sheen's like, don't do it. How does that make us different from them? And Swayze yells out, because we live here, or we're from here, or something like that. And that's essentially the justification of every guerrilla fighter or every resistance fighter is, we're going to do some pretty nasty stuff, but hey, we live here. That's the difference. And we're just trying to get back what's ours, or what we perceive as ours. And I like how Swayze can't do it, and then the dead-eyed kid just blows him away, like in that wide shot. I thought that was pretty effective.
Yeah, see Thomas Howell's Robert, which is perfect for you to be your favorite scene, because my favorite scene is the thing that I think undermines the scene that you're talking about, but I'm being positive because I actually do like the scene itself. Robert making his brave stand with an AK-47 and screaming Wolverines while he's literally hailed down in gunfire by the MiL-24 gunship.
I liked that too.
It's such an incredible moment of him just being like, this is like the ultimate valor, martyrdom of, just being a kid shouting the school mascot at a giant fucking Soviet gunship.
I like that scene too.
Pulverizes him.
I think it works. I think it's his arc. Yeah. He cried in the beginning, and then he became a dead-eyed martyr. I mean, that works for me.
Yeah, my favorite scene was admittedly the Harry Dean Stanton at the fence scene. That's
mine too.
It's pretty incredible.
It's great, and the thing that I liked is the most because it's a great example of like an actor like selling just like an insane script, an insane premise, and he makes it work. And the specific part is when he says, "I was tough on you, but it was for a reason," and that reason. So it's like, I just love the implication hanging there of like, so I beat you, I abused you, I was really bad to you. Your mother has never been brought up probably because I was.
But it's going to turn you into something amazing that's going to be strong and defend your country.
Exactly. I thought that was like, and he sells it. He makes it really damn convincing.
I actually totally agree with what you just said there. I was going to also say that the Harry Dean Stanton at the re-education camp scene was my favorite, and specifically because we didn't bring it up yet, but you just did, was the abuse that was implied, and how they were just like, yeah, now you can be a super soldier, so fucking I'm Father of the Year, you're welcome. I thought that was honestly hilarious, and in a way that still kind of worked, given the who's making the film and also just the premise itself. Like his weird contradictions in that scene I find very just fascinating, like having him the sons be like, be quiet, but he still can't keep it in himself. He has to yell, avenge me, at the same time. Like there's just I don't know if it was just the writing being a little screwy, or if he was actually trying to dive into some contradictions that father might have. But either way, it entertained me, and I found it very interesting.
Yeah, and we also do have to do our rating round as well. So let's get some ratings from the boys. I will say Brendan has slightly convinced me to hang around the high 2 area, just because I do want to acknowledge there's some stuff that Milius and Reynolds are doing in terms of the sentimentality and the self-seriousness. That's not all bad. There's stuff in there that the kids are trying to deliver it, and there's some sequences in there that you could imagine being a little bit more poetic in a movie that fully committed to being that version of the movie, or fully committed to just being, the insane, psycho, violent, martyrdom fantasy where, sort of like high school kids wearing letter jackets become Mujahideen freedom fighters for their NRA dads locked in education concentration camps. And, part of me just kind of goes like, unfortunately, it's doing both movies, and I think if it committed to doing one or the other, we probably have a stronger movie, and the two things just kind of cancel each other out a little bit, especially when we just have such good comparisons to make in terms of people making crazy fascist cartoons in the 70s and 80s and really leaning into the style, or like Michael Winner, like actually believing all of it and creating something just actually kind of evil, or the If Footmen Tire You as well, or things like that. So, you know, part of me just, that's why I can't kind of, I want to almost be like, I don't dislike it that much, but it just, it doesn't quite work for me. So it's going to hang around in like the high 2 territory.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat, I think. I really almost liked this film. It's just I found it got really monotonous and very repetitive by the end, and I lost interest. I did kind of enjoy watching, you know, the relationships between the troops, the rebellion, but a lot of it, like besides Swayze and maybe, I think they try to do something with Thompson a little bit with Powers Booth. They don't really dive into it too much. I think some of it got cut. That's what I read.
They were supposed to have sex, but apparently even test audiences in 1984 were like,
that's a little, it's a little strange. Yeah, totally.
That was probably a good cut.
Yeah, probably.
I don't know.
But
I think you could have said some very interesting things. I'll take the minority position on that.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that because it's cut, it does, you know, take away any nuance of those characters. So really the only one that I could latch onto as a real character that you see a lot of development in, or at least more just interesting performance moments or character moments, was Swayze. There are a couple still with the other kids. I just found them I didn't really learn any of their names. I found their personalities to be kind of very similar, so it was hard to really differentiate them a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's Swayze and his brother versus Killer Kid. See Thomas Howell.
Yeah. And as much as there is a lot of action in this, it isn't the most exciting all of the time because it's
so
like the
flat.
It's a little flat. Like the first time you see it, you're kind of like, okay, this isn't bad, but you're hoping that as the scenes come, as the movie progresses, that they're going to get a little bit more, they're going to expand some way, they're going to get more creative, maybe add a little bit more style in each sequence, but it's just kind of the same, you know, flat explosions, and there's really no squib work or anything like that. I think this was the first PG-13 movie ever in America, I think, is what I read.
Yeah, so, Temple of Doom had a lot of controversy surrounding it that resulted in the PG-13 rating.
So Milius was on either side of the PG-13.
Yeah, Milius is the reason the PG-13 rating exists.
and made the first one.
Yeah. So and I feel like you feel that a little bit, like it pulls it back. I really think if he was gonna make this very hard hitting, emotional war film, he would need it to be more violent and more visceral with that violence, more visually impactful. So I think it would have helped if they actually had more squib work, and like what we were talking about before, like they should have had the teenagers like straight up torturing these commies in the forest and shit. Like that's what would have made it I think just so extreme and more it would have had that thing where we've been talking a lot about how it's like two films trying to balance each other, and it should have just went one way or the other.
It shouldn't have been Rambo. It should have been Deliverance. You know,
right? Exactly. So yeah, and I think that's pretty much everything I had. Oh, and the other thing was that the army itself, like the invaders, like they're obviously, you know, they're communists, but it doesn't seem like. I feel like any army could have been swapped for them when it comes to how they actually talk about things, and it doesn't really dive into the ideology at all. And I would have been more interested in how those two, you know, the like America and the Soviets, both their ideologies would clash more. Instead, it's just kind of like they're on the ground and now they're fighting, and there's not much talk about it.
Well, it's one group likes football and one group likes Sergei Eisenstein films. Right. That's ultimately the battle.
Yeah, exactly.
So, fair enough.
Yeah,
fair enough.
It's a strong 2 for me. I almost liked it, but it falls short by the end, and I got a little tired. I think it needs to cut like 20 minutes or something like that.
Yeah, for you, Brendan and Noah.
I will say 2. You're giving it a 2.
I said 2. It's a 2.
2 scoops. I will say that
You got to give it the 3, man. Come on.
Oh, I was about to tell you. I'm giving it a 3. I think that look, it's a little bit of a boost for me. I don't disagree with anything. We've been kind of agreeing the whole time. I'm just sort of boosting a little bit of the other argument.
I do get the 3, honestly.
I think that there's a level where sometimes it's earned its place as a kind of as something you have to see. You know, even if it's not exactly what you thought or what you would have preferred when you see it, we all know about Red Dawn. You know, everyone's heard of Red Dawn. And so
that's true. There was a 2012 remake. Everyone should check it out. A kid in it says, dude, we're living Call of Duty and it sucks right now. Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton also in the 2012 Red Dawn.
So my rating is a 3. With that out of the way, is there anything you want to say about the remake at all? Because there's really I haven't really seen it.
The only thing that I wanted to mention about it, because I did rewatch it, is that apparently the invaders were originally written in that script to be Chinese.
Yep.
And the studio got cold feet about eliminating the China box office as a market for the film, and last minute they switched it to being North Korea, which that was the only thing. Yep. With CGI, which is fucking crazy.
They just overdubbed.
Wait. They had it already recorded as
they shot it that way and everything.
Oh my god, I didn't know that. That's fucking wild.
It's so bad. It's so watching that. If I had watched that one first, I probably would have 3'd this one when I was doing them.
2 things. Well, if you watch them back to back, this is an instant 3 compared to the other one. But two things that are funny. A, like I said, in this movie, they talk about how the Chinese are on our side, but then by 2012, they were supposed to be the villain. But I also like how it's actually kind of a clever, relatively speaking, it's kind of a clever premise in the finished cut where it's North Koreans, which is the dumbest villain you could. I mean, I know why Americans think North Korea can blow us up at any moment. See our season 3 for that. But the reason that the Chinese were there in the original version was that they had bought up most of America, or we owed them so much money that they were here to collect debts and like take over part
That's actually
of the country.
Sick.
Which is a really clever, which is a pretty clever way to explain like why they're invading. Is like, well, you're not paying us the bill, you know, we're going to take you over now, as opposed to just the North Koreans magically, this tiny,
China as soprano goons coming to collect.
I thought that was pretty funny when I read that. But yes, and it never ended up even playing in China because the Chinese were still like, we know what you did. So, so they screwed it up.
That's so incredible. But yeah, we should move on. The last thing I didn't get to that I wanted to highlight is just very simple. It was a friend of the pod who's coming on in a couple of weeks, Branson Reese, the cartoonist. He had one of my favorite reviews on Letterboxd for Red Dawn. And it's not even deciding on the assessment of the film or anything. It was just, my friend's dad was a cop. And after hearing me say communism, quote unquote, works in theory, he made me watch this in his basement. After the movie ended, he was like, I didn't remember that movie being so bad. And I was like, I mean, it wasn't awful. And so nobody learned anything.
That's the movie for sure.
And that is ultimately, I feel like that little shrug connecting between these two, where they were like, you know, he's like, wow, that was really bad. You know, it's not that bad. You know, that's all. I feel like we just had that experience together. So,
but you also
we should wrap it up on Red Dawn before we get too crazy here. And we should move along over into Red Scorpion. Stick around.
Now he's their punishment. They think they control him. Let's kick some. Think again.
Thought you might need some help!
Dolph Lundgren. Red Scorpion.
All right, we are back and we are talking Red Scorpion, the 1988 war action thriller directed by Joseph Zito and starring Dolph Lundgren. And despite this one not being particularly popular or living in cultural consciousness in the same way that Red Dawn does, I really wanted to talk about this one as the pairing because, like that film, in some ways, it's obviously stemmed from the aftermath of the popularity, cinematically speaking, of something like Rambo. And it also has an insane creative crew and production history that I wanted to hear Brendan and Noah react to and explain a little bit, if they already knew, that could have only occurred in the 1980s. And so on the creative side, we have a couple couple of Sleazoids legends involved here. We have Joseph Zito, one of Cannon's major B-movie guys who made, as Brendan was mentioning, some of Chuck Norris's more well-known sort of like army actioners, Invasion USA, Missing in Action, but also alongside like some pretty gruesome movies, like slasher movies, like The Prowler, and in my opinion, the best Friday the 13th, the fourth one, the final chapter.
I agree.
He is just a like really lean, mean, nasty filmmaker. The Prowler has one of the best head explosions you will see in the 1980s outside of like Bill Lustig's Maniac. In Final Chapter, Jason shoves a knife through a movie screen playing a stag porno and into the back of a horny teenager's skull, which is just like maybe the most fitting sex and death image that franchise ever conjured. Yep. So you pair a guy like Zito with with the cinematographer Juan Fernandez, who does a lot of Cannon movies. You have Jay Chataway doing the music on this. We didn't get to mention the music on the last one, which has like a weirdly sort of like rousing kind of like patriotic bent to it. Maybe not weirdly, that's kind of what it was going for, but it doesn't fit some of the uglier images they tried to put in. But in this, you have the guy who did Bill Lustig's very grimy exploitation horror action films like Maniac Cop and Vigilante, which is actually maybe one of the moodiest and more tonally disturbing knockoff Death Wish sequel movies that were made. And then in front of the camera, obviously Coen's regular Emmett Walsh is in this, who we've talked about recently on Blood Simple, Blade Runner, Raising Arizona, incredible actor, and Dolph Lundgren in the lead role, who we adore on this show and dedicate an entire month on the show, and whose voice you hear in the intro every week saying that you better be listening to Sleazoids.
Yeah, that's right.
Dolph Lundgren is our boy. That month that we did on him was really, really fascinating. We loved dissecting his ability to slot himself into roles that Arnold and Stallone basically passed on for a decade, and somehow through that carving out a unique space for himself and choosing legitimately interesting filmmakers to work with. This came out around the time when he was still figuring out like what that presence was. This came out shortly after Rocky IV, which made him known to the world, and Masters of the Universe, which really didn't really do much for him. But he'd soon be on his way to working with like Mark Goldblatt on his Punisher film, Craig R. Baxley and Dark Angel, Mark Lester, Roland Emmerich for Universal Soldier, Johnny Mnemonic, Russell Mulcahy with fucking that Silent Trigger movie, which is like still one of the craziest direct-to-video like sniper Joseph von Sternberg as like horror films we've ever talked about, and even John Woo on an insane failed TV pilot called Blackjack, which if no one has seen should definitely be looking into that, because I would have watched 10 seasons of Dolph Lundgren as a guy who can't see what was it, white? Or white is like his like kryptonite somehow, like which literally resulted in the villain like throwing milk at him and shit like that. And he also killed people by like throwing cards at them, and it was wonderful.
It's fantastic,
But so like this is a promising crew, one that you'd imagine could deliver on some deliciously ugly B-movie heaven. And I would say in terms of just comparing apples on the on just the action scenes alone, I think Zito wins out in comparison to Milius kind of easily and handily. But the real bizarre twist to all of this, and which is what I'm really hoping that Brendan and Noah will be able to talk to us a little bit about, is the producer and developer of this film. And it was actually through Will and Matt over at Chapo who made me known to this fact when they talked about it. But this was made by, and it was produced, and it was even like basically written, or he hired a writer to tell the story he wanted to tell, by Republican lobbyist Casino Jack Abramoff. And actually, before we got on, I had just finished watching Casino Jack, the movie the biopic about his casino fraud, corruption, and bribery scandal made with Kevin Spacey starring as him pre-House of Cards.
Not a good movie.
Pre a lot of stuff.
Yes, pre a lot of stuff. But I did like learning from that movie that the guy did famously like just really loved movies. And even when in prison, he started a screenwriting class and a movie night for his fellow inmates. So like this is a crazy right-wing lobbyist guy who just really loved movies, wanted to make movies. He grew up in Hollywood and apparently is currently awaiting sentencing on crypto fraud charges right now as we speak. He's still going. But this guy, he watched the Rambo sequel sequels and went, okay, how can I use this type of character and style and turn it into propaganda, not just for America, but for his specific interest in aiding, training, and arming anti-communist guerrilla movements and the South African apartheid government via his International Freedom Foundation, ending up with the concept of Dolph is a Russian KGB agent sent to Africa to kill an anti-communist black revolutionary, but who, of course, over the course of the film, needs to have a change of heart. And he sees how the Russians and Cuban allies are killing and repressing the locals and helping them, like Rambo helped the Mujahideen fighters in Rambo 3. But this has an insane production history that I can't wait to get into about him, you know, actually taking money via his foundation from the South African government, apparently, you know, actually breaking international boycotts and protests to shoot this movie on location, which has the effect of it basically actually being an evil movie, but also kind of benefiting from the fact that it looks pretty authentic. Yep. So your brain will kind of juggle those two things as we talk about this. But maybe Brendan and Noah, Brendan, you were saying you were rewatching. Noah, was this your first time watching?
Yes, this was my first time watching. I was okay. I thought it was the coolest nature documentary about Namibia that I've ever seen.
There is a great elemental purgatory section of the film where Dolph does become one with the land and become the titular red scorpion. Both of these movies actually have a return to tradition. We love the land. You know, we're gonna protect it. You know, kind of.
Well, I mean, they're also operating from the same place in terms of like what is the dilemma that they're sort of purporting to solve as far as, you know. Like for example, you know, in the this is we're getting to get, you know, tell a story in which like the Americans are you know, we're the victims, we get to be partisans, etc. And then, you know, this is one where the Soviets, we are both getting, or the audience is getting both an insight that actually when the Soviets say they're liberating places, they're not liberating them. They're just setting up, you know, like little Orwellian puppet states. And furthermore, that the people who are, you know, like that the people that they're making, you know, the Spetsnaz or whatever are like, you know, these good, actually. Like these like robot automaton types who need to be deprogrammed through, you know, armed struggle, you know, because it's an action movie. And to me, I thought that was sort of like the first part of that was pretty like compelling and interesting to me from the jump.
I thought this movie was actually the other 1988 anti-Soviet movie, The Beast, directed by Kevin Reynolds, who we were discussing earlier. I misremembered the title. And then I remembered it was the Dolph Lundgren one, and I thought, oh, right. But I mean, it's got some fun stuff in it. There's a lot. Okay, however evil listeners might have considered the last film and its intention or its execution with, you know, Reagan's Secretary of State directing it and handling John Milius, the, you know, fever dream of the opening invasion and trying to propagandize against peace with the Soviets. This movie is leagues and leagues more evil. In an actual
100%. But see, do you not think that it's more out in the open? It's more committed? Because that was your argument in the last segment.
Yeah, I mean,
more honest.
it's more. I mean, honestly, I don't think it's trying to do anything as interesting as what Red Dawn was trying and perhaps failing to do. No. But
it's definitely adhering more to a generic structure of a killing machine sees who the real oppressors are and becomes deprogrammed and becomes a killing machine for the opposite side. So like it's already confused even in its own generic description.
I'm conscious. I think we might have overloaded your listeners with our boring history Politico analysis in the Red Dawn section. So I'm going to be brief here, but we have to establish a couple things before understanding why this is such a ridiculous project. In the 1970s, a conflict began in the nation of Angola, in which a Marxist government faced off, or a Marxist party faced off with the CIA-backed and apartheid South Africa backed Christian anti-communist forces in that country, which basically became a civil war. The man behind the actual guerrilla leader, or whatever you want to call him, anti-communist leader, who won the support of the Reagan administration, or the Carter and then Reagan administration, and South Africans, was Jonas Savimbi. And we do an episode on this in season 2, in a bonus episode of Blowback. So if you'd like a longer thing about this, you can go there. But essentially, while in this film it's portrayed as the Soviets trying to take over or crush again, freedom fighters in a country that is trying to sort itself out. It was actively the apartheid government and the CIA fighting to destroy the most popular force in the country, which was the MPLA. That was the Marxist government. And it was not the Soviets that went in, but the Cubans, which is interesting. Another interesting thing about the movie that we can talk about. The Cubans under Fidel Castro felt like they couldn't really make as much progress in Latin America anymore, given that the Americans were, had their eye on them all over the place. So in Africa, there was a chance to back other revolutionary movements, especially those who were still dealing with the aftermath of colonialism and neocolonialism on the part of the United States and South Africa, the apartheid regime. Pretty much as bad as it gets. And so Angola was the site of that. And it spread into Namibia, which is where this movie was shot. And while they don't name the country in the movie, you could view it as
meant to be a fictional African country, but it's absolutely a stand-in for Angola.
Angola or Namibia. And and that is the context through which, it's half the context, because that's where we were actually doing evil shit. But then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, as we've said by now, gave everyone the ability to present the American freedom fighters everywhere in the world as the good
trying
guys.
To kick the Soviets out of places they don't belong.
So then they basically are taking the Angola-Namibia situation and merging it with the Afghanistan situation to turn it into a nameless African country where Afghanistan is kind of happening in Africa, basically. And that's unsurprising because, as you mentioned, and I'm happy to actually, Josh, give you the lion's share of the Jack Abramoff stuff because I could be a little rusty, but the long-standing con man and right-wing operator Jack Abramoff who was working to discredit Nelson Mandela and the ANC in South Africa, was behind the propaganda efforts to boost the profile of Jonas Savimbi. And so this movie, he's essentially a character in the movie who's great and who Dolph Lundgren is sent to assassinate, but learns is a true man of the people. And not getting any Stinger missiles from Washington, which is in fact what really happened, and was also an
this is actually incredibly specific propaganda versus Red Dawn, which had a little bit, it was painting in broad strokes of symbols. This is like incredibly, like, we have a specific leader. We have an analogy for, and we want you to like cathartically feel your way through a movie you've seen before where they are being oppressed and you're someone who can help them, and all of a sudden, you're going to actually help them. But it could not be more of a revisionist, like ridiculous way of doing that.
Which is why they don't say what country it is, because there's always the chance you could read about it in the paper and go, oh, what? That doesn't sound right. That guy's a Christian fundamentalist warlord. They play it kind of vague.
Not like some like spiritual leader,
But anyway, that's the background. So when we're talking about like why is it so fucked up, is that they violated what was widely considered to be a taboo, which is working with the South African government in any way, shape, or form. If you were an artist, they violated that. Cooperated with the government, got a lot of goodies for the movie that way. It was funded and produced by a lobbyist for South Africa and for its puppets in the region. And then, of course,
this was a big no-no even amongst like movie studios. Like they were being boycotted and protested for doing this kind of stuff, and they were told to stop filming, which they wouldn't do. And they at one point actually did have to stop shooting this movie at one point due to the assassination and execution of members of the anti-apartheid liberation group, the African National Congress. Congress who were being murdered like not far from where they were shooting, using the military equipment that they were, like not the exact devices, but like they were the South African military that was carrying out those executions was letting them borrow their vehicles and weapons to use in the movie, doing their literal racist genocide next to where they were shooting. It's crazy.
It would be like if Transformers Kingdom of the Moon was shooting in Iraq while we were doing Fallujah, basically.
Right. Yeah. Like it's actually insanely evil.
Yeah. So, let's just get that off. Let's nip that in the bud.
Yeah. But narratively, they kick things off by just showing you, some slideshow images of Mr. Dolph Lundgren. And I do like that they basically are doing Ivan Drago exploitation, because they even have his hair on the poster that doesn't match the hair that he has in the movie. Like they're like, did you like Rocky 4? Well, come check out Rocky 5. Rambo looks different, where he is the sweaty robotic meathead.
No. It's Rocky 5. We want like just a. Oh wait, sorry, I misunderstood you. Please continue.
No, where he is the
cut Noah being obtuse. We got to cut that as well.
He is the sweaty robotic meathead Soviet Spetsnaz operator from Ukraine, and he appears in an ominous political back room filled with cigar smoke and grinning, and the Soviets and Cubans all
speaking English.
All speaking English, and the General Vortak, played by T.P. McKenna, speaking of Sam Peckinpah, actually, Straw Dogs, with being sent to this fictional African country to assassinate this ruthless anti-communist rebel leader and a killer of children who was nonetheless beloved, is probably my favorite detail in the biography that they give of the guy, where they were like,
honest, no.
Yeah, well, because he's just like, he's like, Dolph immediately goes, well, would he, like, well, they must hate him then if he's doing all these terrible things to them, and they're like, actually,
Soviet
they love him.
Propaganda, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's what's funny is like he's already questioning his orders and the propaganda before he's even left. And he is meant to assassinate this Engo Sundata, who, as Brendan mentioned, was the stand-in for Jonas Savimbi, and who is leading an armed guerrilla movement against the government, and they're aiding Soviet, Czechoslovakian, and Cuban forces. And he is actually assigned to one of the captured warlords, a man named Kalunda Kintash, played by Al White, to go undercover and befriend him and basically like locate his superior on the way there. But it is interesting that right off the bat, you can tell by the way he interacts with them and the way he carries even his physique. I think King fucking Kong, Emmett Walsh calls him at one point, that he does not respect like his communist leaders like at all.
Right.
He's just like, he's just it's actually why he's perfect as someone who's going to go undercover and get himself arrested for disorderly conduct, because he's just like, when he's just drunkenly like beating up his fellow soldiers and like spraying machine gun fire into the bar all around him and stuff, you're like, this kind of makes more sense for the character than the idea that he is like an ideological believer in the cause of any kind.
He's
really
not Ivan Drago in this.
No. Not despite the fact that he has also been programmed to be, a killer for the cause. I do like that line too. Are you out of your mind? He's like, no, just out of bullets.
Yep. He tried to sell it.
Dolph, unfortunately, he is being asked to do like a midpoint between like a Stallone and a Schwarzenegger. And we talked about this a lot when we talked about his full career, is that he did get a lot better as an actor when he realized that he like didn't have to play into the image that the execs clearly wanted him to be. And he started he's actually a funny guy. He actually is better in like the buddy cop stuff that he was doing, like that movie with Brandon Lee, Showdown in Little Tokyo and stuff. And this is not his finest hour as an actor, I would say. He was still learning English too, to be fair.
I have nothing but love for Dolph Lundgren, but he is not charismatic or compelling in the film. It's just it falls flat. His character falls flat because he's not given anything. He's just supposed to be this glistening, he
looks
Soviet
great.
Turco. He looks great.
He looks awesome. There's so many shots. There's so many shots that just begin with him lying in the dirt naked, basically, except for like a loincloth or some shit. And then he just like pulls himself up. Like it's pretty. I was honestly like I was expecting more Cobra kind of stuff, but there's really a lot of sequences of Lundgren just like with like the most perfect body imaginable.
Yeah.
Like,
I love that scene where he's stripping and Walsh is screaming like take it off, take it all off, and they've been literally incorporating this moment into the film so that when the mortar fire eventually hits and the action scene starts, it's so Dolph can be shirtless and greased up while he's firing his his rifle and everything like that. They really want like the Commando era sort of like Schwarzenegger shots.
Take it for what you will. I think that was the best scene in the film. I thought that was my favorite scene. I thought it was the best executed.
I mean, I actually will say, personally, I like the whole original escape before he hits the actual like rebel camp itself. Like the sequence where they meet Dewey Ferguson, who is a American reporter they call propagandist, played by Emmett Walsh, in a great actor, but they give this character like no detail. Like I assume he was supposed to be like this movie's version of like James Woods in Salvador, where he's like exposing war crimes, but like doing so a bit like selfishly, but he's also just kind of like a symbol of like the free loving American schlob a little bit. It's kind of a strange role.
He doesn't trust he doesn't trust Dolph. That's his main character point until he does. And then it's his arc.
Yeah, and he's the one who's trying to help this supposed warlord Kintash escape the evil Russian prison guards, including one played by as I think Noah wanted to mention early, Brian James, the weird looking guy from Blade Runner, as everyone knows him.
And he's also in Total Recall.
Oh, that's right too.
And he's in it. Like his whole thing is that he died. I mean, not his whole thing is that he died. Like he died in like 2002. But like he was in 5 million different movies. Like it's kind of like
Southern Comfort, Flesh and Blood.
He's in Red Heat. He's in another Red movie, which is Red Heat.
That's true.
Yeah,
and
he
also
recognizable character actor, and he's always
was he in The West Wing? Am I getting that right too?
Probably.
Maybe.
I feel like he was. I feel like he was a Secret Service agent in The West Wing. But
I just watched him recently in Tango and Cash, actually.
Oh wow!
Because I every time he pops up, I'm always like, who the hell is that guy? And then I look him up, and I'm like, oh right, it's this guy.
I've always wondered which came first, the Tango or the Cash.
He and Emmett,
the movie doesn't answer it, actually.
He and Emmett seem to be having the most fun, I would say, with their characters. Like Brian James, every time he's on screen, he's got that. It's pretty similar to the performance he puts on with Blade Runner. He's got that very wide-eyed, kind of maniacal stare.
What happens to him, though? Did any of you pick up does he just leave?
He just kind of isn't in it at some point. I don't know.
Yeah, because this is my second time watching it, and I actually was trying to pay attention because I always can't figure out why he's not like in the finale.
I have no idea,
because they set him up as kind of like the big guy that he would fight or something, but I don't know. It's weird.
Yeah, they have a general guy that is more just the guy giving orders, and Brian James plays the one that's more like on the ground. He's burning people with cigars and shooting people and all of that. But yeah, I don't think he is in the finale.
Because he gets his nose broken. No, that's a different guy.
I just want to mention he's in the movie House 3, in which he stabs a baby in the head.
Oh my god!
You got to look up House 3. He's
right now.
He plays this.
I'm literally watching this.
And I'm not kidding. I mean, it's one of those few times in a movie where you're like, holy shit, they killed a baby.
He's like second bill with Lance Henriksen. So let's go.
Yeah.
Oh my god, that's got to be a top tier movie.
You guys should check that one out.
That looks crazy.
You should check that one out.
I'm gonna watch that. Also, I did not know he's in Scanner Cop, so apparently I'm gonna be watching Scanner Cop at some point.
You should just make this a Brian James.
Yeah, we should. We're gonna rebrand as the Brian James Show.
Sleazoids is over. Now it's the Brian James podcast.
I'll change my name to Brian James from Brendan James.
Oh, there you go. But yeah, he is the one who's like abusing them in the prison where Dolph has gotten himself arrested for disorderly conduct to go in there. And obviously they immediately go, why are we in prison with like a Russian guy? Like, this is fucked up. This guy looks like the poster child for the guy who's like murdering us. Why is he hanging out in here?
Yeah,
he looks like the guy literally on the propaganda, for.
Yeah, I think Emmett's character even mentions that he knows of Nikolai in some way. So I guess he's kind of like a prolific killer of some kind.
Yeah, but of course it is the big Ruski Dolph who has to knock out Brian James and the guards to prove his loyalty to the rebel cause. And this sequence I thought is the strongest one, where they escape the prison, they hijack a truck, and by hiding in the back of it, and Dolph has to actually use a bayonet to rip his way through the top of it, climb on top, and actually kick his way into the driver's seat, which kicks off like a full chase gunfight with doors being blasted off, like Emmett Walsh hanging out the side of the windows, blasting, firing a shotgun to the tune of Little Richard,
which is just a straight Predator rip off of that needle drop.
Yeah,
well, and I mean, I thought it was like it was also a rip off of the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
scene, which is in a great way.
100.
Like that,
yeah, it was
to me,
like a diet version of it, and it wasn't in that. Yeah, like you said, it's not in a bad way.
Yeah, it's it's definitely, to me, that's like, it felt like very, probably like economical given like the constraints they were working with. But I was very entertained by that, because it's also like, again, more scenes where Dolph is doing stuff like that and not talking is like the better. Yeah,
and he honestly, I think he's got like, it seems like 10 lines in this whole film. He's really used as just the muscle. He's
used in the same way Arnold used to be used, where it was like you are there because you have a very striking image that you fit, and it is like you are a physical specimen to watch do what you do.
Yeah, this even has the like commando finale where he's got the war paint on, and he's like the headband, and his muscles are out, and his shirt's cut up and everything, and there's just explosion after explosion, and a whole base being destroyed. So it does very much.
They're like tanking through the roadblocks. They're throwing grenades at motorcyclists and like flipping them. And there's cameras actually attached to the vehicles and the mirrors and the tires while they like flip and explode. So like, despite the fact that the writing and the drama of this is still pretty like C-grade evil Republican fantasy that is also kind of like on a character level so generic, and you've seen it before that you can't get a whole lot out of it. Zito 100% in terms of conceiving actual action set pieces, the flow of them, where the camera should be, actually finding like dramatic gestures, and like how a character is like, oh, I need to actually, there is a point where, speaking of like the Raiders bit, he doesn't go underneath the truck like Stagecoach style, but there is a part where he actually has to like jump his way off the truck onto a cycle, and then actually crash the cycle back into the truck so he can hop back into the truck. And it's like, like that is actually, there is some physical, pretty incredible stunt work being done, and some pretty massive, on top of the massive sort of expensive destruction work that both of these films had. Because it's actually worth noting, both of these films share the fact that they both started out as like $6 to $8 million movies, and both ended up being almost $20 million movies. So both of these movies are actually more expensive than they should have been. And graciously enough, you can kind of see it in the action scene specifically.
I will also say that like, I just want to say that I thought that like the landscape was also in Red Scorpion. It really is like honestly worth watching alone, just for a lot of the places that they set this in. I was pretty surprised because
that's what I was saying earlier when I was like, the how they did that is incredibly evil, but like it actually does kind of pay off. Like the location work and really filming on these military bases and really filming in these deserts, like it leads to some actually very nice looking imagery.
I would
but in the back of your head, you're like, oh my God, like the only reason they could possibly do that is because of all the murdering, where if they were to pan the camera, you could see it,
And
I would love to read a Don DeLillo book set on like the set of this movie.
Absolutely.
It is wild, like due to these really controversial and pretty horrible choices too, that's the reason they had all these delays and had to spend $10 million extra dollars. So they paid for it at least a little bit in karma, I guess.
So they definitely put it on themselves. But Noah's totally right. Like one of the things that's so striking about the movie is like some of the actual vistas, like the sequence, the part of the film when he starts to be seduced by like the freedom loving ways that, he doesn't understand. It's like Emmett Walsh just swearing a lot and like talking about cheeseburgers and beer. That's the one side of it. But the other side of it is Kintash's love for his homeland, which is being terrorized, by Dolph's comrades, and, their huts huts are being burned down by men in silver hazmat suits, and they're dropping some sort of chemical oil weapon on their skin, which Brendan was alluding to earlier with was it yellow rain or whatever they called it. Yeah.
Yep.
And, and having their children murdered in cold blood in order to psychologically break the adults who might rebel is something that they mention is one of their tactics. And so the relationship with Kintash and, his idea of one day this oppression will end and this land will be returned to us. And the beauty of the land is probably one of the only sort of successful directorial choices to actually get you involved in that. You do kind of go, wow, this is a beautiful place. These are amazing vistas that Dolph is hanging in. And when he eventually does do his elemental, I'm gonna, actually become one with it in some way, there is at least a little bit of imagery to back it up, even if dramatically it's still pretty trite.
Mm-hmm.
Trite, yeah. It's interesting because
that was the word Brendan got at all of that.
I don't know. I liked the set pieces. I was very bored in every other moment of the movie. I thought there were some interesting contrasts with Red Dawn, because as we've discussed at this point, Red Dawn perhaps failed, but tried to do something a little bit more interesting. I thought it was definitely fascinating how Red Scorpion does the exact opposite of Red Dawn with the Ron O'Neal character, making the Cubans completely obsequious and more bloodthirsty than the Russians, whereas Red Dawn had the Russians as the Empire from Star Wars, and the Cubans were a little bit more.
I think that if anything, that's the influence of the South Africans, because they really fucking hated the Cubans.
That's what I wanted to underline is the reason probably is that the lobby that this film answers to is directly fighting Cubans in the war, even more than the Soviets. They have to put the Soviets in because that makes it seem like it's an empire against them, which it was not. But the Cubans are the ones who actually talked the Soviets into supporting the progressive forces inside of Angola and then later Namibia. So they really make the Cubans. The guy who sticks 8 different knives in Dolph
one
Lundgren.
of the best scenes in the movie, though. You have
it's
to
great.
admit,
it's cool.
Yeah.
But that guy's Cuban, and unlike the Red Dawn thing where he's like, man, should I really be lending my talents to this particular mission? He's like just a absolutely bloodthirsty, psychopath.
The Soviets are definitely shown as to be more just pragmatic and practical and and intelligent, whereas you're right, that guy has a much more maniacal sense to him, and he's almost laughing as he's torturing Dolph and all of that.
Yeah,
so, yeah,
right.
totally.
That is such a specific detail from that rare moment in the 80s where really shooting men and their bodies in the way that they do it at that time actually fit into the dramatics of the scene that was taking place.
Sure.
Because that's when Dolph is actually handed back, because we'll get into some of the how he makes his way to the camp, how he fails his assassination, he gets recaptured and everything like that. But he's actually being at that point tortured by the Soviets are disappointed in him that he failed his mission at being the perfect killing machine and the pride of the Soviet army, and they are punishing him for doing that by handing him over to the Cubans, where they hand him to the needle specialist who
it's a whole ministry in the Cuban government.
Charged Cuban needle specialist, though, he not only he's finding little fleshy parts of him that he can find that aren't the 2 spots that aren't rock solid on his body, and they're being I'm gonna pierce you with this needle, and he's doing things like, I can stick this into you all night long, and and it's so insane. And it's also worth noting that Zito, longtime friend of Tom Savini, and so Tom Savini is actually doing the gore makeup on this as well, of the needles actually going through his bicep and going through his neck
great.
and everything like that. It does.
It looks so good.
Yeah. Yeah, that first one he does where he goes through his pec on the right side, it kind of looks real. Honestly, it's really good makeup work.
I mean, it again doesn't compare to Joseph Zito and Tom Savini, the gore effects they would do on a Friday the 13th, but it's one of those gestures that does make its way into the movie, and you do see it in the finale a little bit too, when he's blowing entire arms off, and things like that eventually happen too. This is a nastier R-rated action movie in comparison to Red Dawn, which is trying to pick up a kid audience.
And then you get back to dialogue everything breaks down in Africa.
Yeah, what a line.
It's like, well, then why are you pouring money into it to your fascist government? Then why don't you just get the hell out?
And also followed up by looks like the killing machine is breaking down. When they're trying to talk.
That's what causes him. He says, looks like the killing machine's breaking down. That's what M. Emmett Walsh says, and he goes, "Don't worry, everything breaks down in Africa." So it's like, the dialogue is just his choice.
Well, and I love too that he's literally just like saying out loud what we are seeing, which is that like he's looking at the massacres that his superiors are ordering and just like feeling sad, realizing who the real oppressors are. And it's just so funny to have M. Emmett Walsh on the side of that scene be like, looks like the killing machine is breaking down.
Fascist,
like it's just
fascist realism. It is just literal. You have to literally say what's going on and then embrace the violence. Yeah. How the fuck am I supposed to know? And it's just great because, I mean, the idea that the Soviets were leveling villages in any country in Africa, just total fantasia. And it's supposed to be, this is Afghanistan, but we're putting it in the other country, you know? And again, with the chemical, we don't have to go on about it, but the chemical warfare scene, which is like a big, moment to hate I get it. Like a dramatic moment, you want to hate them.
Well, yeah, they're leaning into like the full psycho fantasy horror of these people decimating the
it's not just
Africans.
It's not just being sprayed by chemical agents. There's guys in hazmat suits, as you pointed out, who go in manually,
lighting them on fire after. Yeah.
Not only, the Soviets
seems like overkill.
Not only did they not do that in Afghanistan, they certainly did not do that in any country in Africa. Complete and total projection of what the Americans did in Southeast Asia. And again, that's why they love showing it. That's why they love pretending like.
Well, and it gets to use the vocabulary of Vietnam movies a little bit too, right? Like it's a greatest hits. It's a greatest hits.
It's everything. It's complete. It's just taking everything that got used against the Americans for decades and going, now we get to use it because it turns out it really makes you hate the villains when people do these things. So
I do think that like between Red Dawn and this, like there's a lot of helicopter obsession. So like at Scorpion, you see a lot of Soviet helicopters get blown up, and it's very Afghanistan heavy. And then alternately in Red Dawn, you have the first conflict of the movie is the American like when they're getting out of town and they're saved by an American combat helicopter that blows up a Soviet position. And that is like the first thing you see. And it's like, holy shit, like the Huey got something done, like that's the I think that to me is like the thing it's supposed to convey. Like it's very, anti-platoon, so to speak. And I think here it's just Red Square is the other end of that dialectic of just like, like this is now also where we are showing the maximalist like portrayal, like, like the imagery of the stinger, like as an archetype in right wing discourse, like really fucking like blows up here. So
in fairness, both the Mujahideen and Savimbi both got stingers. So they're
but again, this is not about Angola though. This is about what's it called?
I don't know. Well, it is about Angola, but it is about Afghanistan as well. I mean, like we said, it's a fever dream.
You know what else is about Africa and Afghanistan?
Mm-hmm. What?
Metal Gear Solid 5 Phantom Pain.
Oh, that's true. That's true. It is actually the same because it's Zaire. Angola border region, right? In Metal Gear 5, right?
Yeah. So it's all about MPLA Angola.
Exactly. So yeah, if anyone wants a vastly somehow more accurate depiction of the conflict, even though there's a giant robot that swings a whip around, just play the Phantom Pain. And then watch.
You'll learn more from Kaz Miller's monologues.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Hideo Kojima should have ended up writing a movie like one of these at some point.
I'd
like to see that.
Don't make me think of what could have been.
Yeah, but most of this I will say, like after the breakout sequence and after, like them making their way to the actual rebel village and Dolph starting to learn the error of his ways and everything, the movie does kind of feel like it slows down a bit for me, especially in like that last hour or so.
Oh yeah.
It can't keep up that momentum of like just like having, doing like a Raiders chase in your first like 30 minutes. And then all of a sudden, it sticks more in the realm to him being imprisoned or having like funny, sort of like action movie star beats, like when he tricks that guard to get closer to him and then like with a single hand lifts him off his feet and smashes his head into the bars so he can get the keys and go out. And he does that so he can break out and perform his assassination mission, but he's obviously caught. before he can do so. And I kind of thought that they were, this would be like they would torture him or they would kill him. But no, they are the people that don't do that kind of stuff. So they actually just like throw him back to his own people as a symbol of humiliation, which is when then he gets homoerotically tortured by his own his own men. But of course, at that point, he's like, well, I can't trust anybody. So he needs to break out for the second or third time. This is the third time, actually, because he breaks out of his own guards when he's undercover. Then he breaks out while with the rebels, and then he breaks out like in earnest from his actual government who's torturing him. And so 3 breakouts for Dolph Lundgren. And what follows for like the finale is basically there's 2 parts to this. It is the epic nighttime desert cross, like direct-to-video Lawrence of Arabia, where he is stung by a bunch of poisonous scorpions and needs to be reborn with like ritual medicine of the indigenous Bushmen, and learns how to live off the land and spear a warthog. And
it's how the movie's not racist, I think, personally.
Well, yeah, no, he smokes scorpion crack. So like, of course, like that's just, he's good. And then he gets tattooed with like the titular red scorpion on his chest as a symbol of respect for the primal land that he's now become one with. He, of course, gets to throw away his dog tags. He's been deprogrammed as the killing machine. And meanwhile, while all of that is happening, obviously the evil communists who don't respect the land or its people and are machine-like, they escalate their unnatural assault on the rebels. And that's when they're like mortaring and gunshipping their bases, like straight up using, I think, a lot of the similar gunships from obviously Rambo 3 as well, which speaks to Brendan's point that this is also meant to be just Afghanistan. And, just getting kind of a little bit of a monotonous destruction montage of like straw roof structures. It's massive explosions. But it's just, it's the same shot over and over again, like dirt and smoke plumes and stunned guys on jump pads. And although I will say, Noah, I have to ask you about this. Where did you watch this movie? Because that bit where you watched the goats being blown up,
I watched it on Amazon Prime. I watched it on Amazon Prime, and I just
was that really the subtitle?
Yeah. I posted,
That's
so I posted,
incredible.
like, I don't delete my tweets. This will still be up, assuming Twitter is still up by the time this comes out. But let me see. I just want to make sure. Yeah, so I said mood. So search mood for me, and I said it's in the subtitle. It says goats crying in desperate horror, and then continued cries as the goats existentially face their fate. So here's the thing, though, is that I think this movie was re-released by Troma.
Yeah,
okay.
It was. Yeah.
So, like, my guess is that they did the and they do cheeky, more knowing
subtitle tracks.
Yeah. So that's my guess, is that, like, because I don't think that this was a creative master stroke from the people at Amazon, but it did. It was a good tweet. It was good fodder for the internet.
That's
I was
so
like, my
funny.
subtitles did not have that, and but I was definitely, it made sense watching these images of these goats
it is
being
really fucked up, because
exploded on
now that I'm
screen.
actually looking at these pictures, in these pictures, all the goats are just like huddled in terror in the corner closest to the camera, far away, while they're just like these massive explosions in the background, like a burning tank. And
and you know that there was no regulations on this movie. Joseph Zito wouldn't have fucking given a shit. He was like, no, give me this. He was like, give me all of the South African military equipment.
Like,
let me just blow your land up.
There's just
for
like a ton
while.
of trauma in these goats.
No. The one thing that the apartheid government really cared about was the goats' right, the animal rights goat status.
Exactly.
on the film. That was priority. That was
That was the
priority
one
number
thing
one.
they cared about.
Yeah.
What'd you guys think of Dolph arriving at the village and everyone praises him like he's Jesus, just surrounding him?
Yeah. Let's
like a
kick some
healer.
ass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, then you're getting into obviously white savior. I mean, it's kind of amazing.
It is like a movie where it's kind of to me, it felt like the reason I kind of liked it more than I liked Red Dawn as a viewing experience was just because even for all like the unpleasant moments and stuff, like it just washed over me. It's really like very. I don't know. It's like an anti-picaresque or something. Like, it's not funny, but there is this kind of like weird hero's journey that we're following with this guy who doesn't really talk, and there's not really any reason we're made to believe that he's likable, but he's helping the good guys, but is he? And it's very. Yeah, I found
it's
it
so
like a
confused that it's like
yeah, exactly.
Well, I was gonna say,
but it's also but then that's in contrast to like these like incredibly much like Red Dawn and these kind of again like as we've been harping on like these hyper literal representations of existing political of somewhat real political situations. It's just like it's I don't know, it's like hyper ironized already. Like as you experience, like, there's no other way that I can experience it at this point in time. Like it's I do love it like for that like as like a kind of object
cold.
for that reason.
It's no stone cold.
Well, nothing is stone cold.
Nothing is stone cold. I was hoping for a bit more, especially with someone like Zito at the helm. But he's got.
Well, but I will say, like, for ways that you could argue is either a positive for the film or a negative for the film, I think that the thing that Red Dawn did lack, which was by the end of the film, getting to the destruction and actually feeling the maybe morally repugnant catharsis you're meant to feel about this journey that he's gone on and the the level of revenge that he's getting. Like, this blows the finale of Red Dawn out of the water in terms of, like shooting the big evil guy and you just kind of feel nothing. And, Patrick Swayze turns a corner and like yells something and that's it. And then it's over. Because that movie is obviously also more interested in like the somber image of him and the brother on the bench holding each other and that kind of stuff. This does lean full out into just the
80s
let's kick some ass, Dolph Lundgren killing machine now on the other side of the fight, and that incredible image of him in the camo shorts and war paint, like going around just like shotgunning Cubans left and right. At one point going head to head in a stare down with a tank, and then lifting a truck with his bare hands, using the pure strength and his belief in defeating communism so that he can grab a cannon so that he can then slap the cannon that then blows up the tank.
And there's also like, I gotta say, the editing on that sequence with the truck is like one of the most blatant, like, like there's nothing clever about it. It really is the like, oh, whoop, his hands are here. Oh, whoop, but the truck's being raced here. Oh, whoop, but his hands are here. And I was like kind of hoping for a little bit more tension because Emmett Walsh's life was on the line.
True.
Yeah, there was one I did like too that was kind of creative where the guy is holding the big like anti-tank grenade that's going to explode the whole upper floor with Dolph involved as well. And so instead he just shoots his arm off so that he can't actually pull the like grenade pin or whatever.
Yeah, he has to crawl towards his own gory, dismembered arm holding the grenade to try and throw it, which obviously he can't get to in time. And then he just fucking explodes inside the building, already littered with like blood mist and the machetes that Dolph has been throwing around and whatever else.
Yeah, and he's been one-handing this like giant machine gun that is, I guess, it's a historical artifact of some kind or something. It's like propped up in the Soviet office.
That is definitely meant to be the Rambo Part 2 when he's holding the gun and shooting the supercomputer.
And that's the difference,
literally
right? It's
murdering intelligence.
Because it doesn't have as much, I guess, like sentimentality, it's able in this finale and in other parts too to be a little bit more 80s maximalist and cartoonish, which does have its entertaining value, of course. It's just, I agree though that like everything in between did bore the shit out of me. The action stuff is fun because it's fun to watch stuff explode, and when they get creative with it every once in a while, it's interesting to see what a director comes up with. But it's just everything in between.
I would say that's just it, is that you feel like Milius was more invested in the stuff between the action and with some of the scenes with the kids and with scenes like that execution scene or the hunting scene or some of these, Patrick Swayze holding another kid and telling him to cry and use that cry and turn it into anger and hatred so he can get revenge and that kind of stuff. Like, it felt like Milius had more investment in some of the dramatics there, whereas Zito literally has no interest in this film beyond how it serves the crazy destructive spectacle and the sort of hyper violence that he likes. And so like that's just it, is that if it depends on what kind of stuff you're more into when you watch a movie like this. I do think that Red Scorpion could play better to people who just want to get the lizard braid going and see a guy's arm get blown off and see a tank explode. And, because this, in terms of the pure action, Zito is doing a better job than that film. But everything else in between is a mix of incredibly generic and incredibly evil at the same time.
And the other thing I'll say is that, like, you know, one of the things I really don't like about Red Dawn is I hate the like schmaltzy like wide shots of like the American plains. And
Jesus,
like,
man,
to me,
you fucking hate all the parts that are about like hunting and trees and
I'm a fucking Eagle Scout, man. I love nature. I've been, you know, I spent I like, you know, I have nothing.
Well, then you're just jealous. You wish this happened.
No, I'm
to
not
you,
jealous.
clearly.
I just think that it's like fucking. It's like the most like it's like beyond. It to me, it's like, yeah, that's like Motel 8 like wallpaper
Right.
bullshit. It's beyond cliche.
Well, not
and
to
then,
go
you know,
back
you
to
watch
it,
like,
but it is true that.
but you
Milius
watch and then
did-
you watch like Red Scorpion though, and it's like, okay, these are not like this story, and like the beats in this thing don't like resonate with me in the same way that like Milius's like you know like story does. But like as a spectacle, I was very much like I was really intrigued. And look, like Dolph Lundgren at that thing, he when he opens his mouth and he's not that charismatic, blah blah blah. It is like he's crazy to look at, and he's shirtless for so much of it.
Yeah, I would say a couple of the set pieces, you know, it's good. It's good. It's a good effort. I was also bored. I was mind-numbingly bored during the journey into the desert with the Bushmen.
Me too.
I was just like, get on with it, because at that point they cut back to, I don't even fucking remember. Is it Al White they keep cutting back to, or someone else where it's like a B plot, and then we keep cutting back to Dolph, who should be the A plot, but
they keep cutting back to, I think, the village is being destroyed while Dolph is going through this like nature transformation. It just kind of goes back and forth until
it just
they
felt
finally get to it.
so meandering, and we all know what the stock, you know, plot point is taking place.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we all know what the arc is at this point. Like,
Yeah.
we already
that's
know
the
how
thing.
evil they're supposed to be. We already know that he already is having doubts.
I'm
about
sorry, you
and,
guys
like,
didn't
becoming,
like it when like every 5 minutes something else would happen, and this like old guy Bushman would just go like
I also,
and like laugh really creepily.
You also-
whatever.
I will say some of the imagery was nice. Like, the actual desert vistas were nice.
Well, that's the thing. I was like, this is the
I liked when he made
the
him
coolest,
sandals.
weirdest nature documentary.
But you also don't want to leave the audience too much time to think about, is this guy an actor, or is this someone that the incredibly shady Gladios style operation has somehow like whisked away from their actual home and has put in this movie? Because, you know,
I didn't even think of that,
everyone else
actually.
in the movie speaks
Very
English.
possible.
Like everyone
Yeah.
else, all the people who are supposed to be Russian and all that, like they all speak
that's
English.
a bummer to think about.
I'm just saying, we can't back away from the fact that it was an evil production. So
Well, I don't want to wind this
true.
down on a bummer though.
I wasn't. Yeah, I mean, but let's. How about that?
Well, we
Long Tall
can
Sally?
end off with Dolph seeing the true enemy of the people and seeing why they fight now, and turning that into him exploding his general inside of one of the giant gunships, which is a fun little moment,
Yes.
even though it is like it's straight up as simple as, we sent you to aid in an oppressed people, and he's like, but you didn't tell me who the oppressors were. And he turns on his heel and just fucking explodes him. And the incredible final gesture of this entire movie is when the movie just ends on him exploding the guy and getting the catharsis for blowing up the general who gave him these shitty orders,
Yep.
and walking with all of the rebel fighters. And it freeze frames as he's covered in blood, walking next to them, going fucking A, like a true
Yeah, they're
American,
smiling.
being able to swear, being vulgar.
Yeah.
And then you have the Little Richard rock music kick back in again during the credits.
Yep.
And over the course of the credits, you can still hear gunfire and explosions going off, because they are literally celebrating like starting a glorious war.
Oh yeah.
Which is
Hell
fucking like a crazy little detail that I don't
it's
know.
nuts.
Like that is one of the most like fascist things included in either of these movies, is that like it's like rock and roll is going to defeat communism, and
Wow.
we've started it, but now it continues with you, the audience, walking out listening to this rock
A
music.
shipment of blue jeans arrived in that.
Yes.
A bunch of Jordaki jeans just like showed up at the end.
And Dolph Lundgren's character is now today a grizzled commander of the the Azov Battalion in Ukraine, which is good to know.
Which, by the way, did you either of you note that thing about I can't remember where I read it. I think it might have been on the Red Dawn page where there was something to do with someone.
Yeah,
was it Red Dawn?
Yeah. The Wolverines is used as graffiti, like in the film was used. Honestly, I'm not trying to sound silly. It really could have been propaganda, like a psyop. It was supposedly used in Ukraine during the Russian invasion's early months as graffiti. Like the Wolverines.
Yeah, it was like spray painted on or something like that.
It sounds very fishy to me, but I suppose it's possible. I think that sounds like something cooked up in order to have Western audiences recognize a cultural product of their own.
I don't think it sounds soy at all.
And it's certainly not soy.
It's not soy at all.
So, yeah, I mean, Red Scorpion,
that's it.
Similar to how I brought Josh around a little bit. I guess I'm appreciating some of the action a little bit more, but I was less interested in Red Scorpion.
I give it a 3.
You're giving it a 3. Okay.
Oh, okay. We got the reverse. I'm still kind of hovering around in the same territory. It's reversed. You're hovering
reasons, around that Angolan Zaire border territory.
That's right in the middle
in a gunship.
You're just screaming "Hi 2" at them.
Yeah, I'm in the 2 territory as well. I think the action is pretty decent, and I do like watching Dolph just.
Well, Zito and Tom Savini doing effects work and doing the throwing in some of that canon maximalist 80s absurdity. Like it's just you're gonna get some fun out of that. I think there's some apparently incredibly dangerous actual stunt work here. Dolph apparently did do that stunt going from the motorcycle to the truck.
That's always impressive.
That's awesome. That's pretty sick. Yeah, that sequence is pretty cool. Like having a Diet Raiders of the Lost Ark scene is pretty badass. But also using South African apartheid government military equipment to do it while they're murdering people off screen.
Let's leave that out of the rating, because if we have to assess it, I mean, if
this would be a 0 if we were incorporating that.
Yeah,
exactly.
Morality rating 0. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
But I mean, the Twilight Zone movie is fine, but I can't, grade it on a fucking human level.
Yeah, definitely. 2.
Yeah, it really wasn't good, was it?
The action.
I don't know anything about what happened in its making, though.
Well, let's not stop. No, he's kidding.
Did something bad happen when they were making?
We're trying to not end on a bummer.
Noah,
we specifically said we're not going to end on a bummer.
Noah, are you kidding? Or I'll tell you after. Or do you want me to tell you after?
Wait, no, Brendan, tell me. What horrible incident could have possibly happened?
Okay, so you're kidding around. Okay, so wait, what was Josh's rating? Who's rating?
Josh's was a 2. Mine was a 2. Just because action sequences were good and or at least entertaining, and but just everything in between bored the shit out of me. So
and Dolph, stunning
Dolph
physical specimen.
Yes,
even if he would become a much better actor over the next 10 years.
Yeah, he's innocent as far
not
as
him
I'm
in
concerned.
his prime.
Noah.
Yeah.
No.
I gave it a 3. I stand by my 3.
Oh yeah, that's true. It's all up to you, Brendan. You're deciding vote here.
I have to. I'm gonna give it a 2. It was. I'm in agreement where it just felt like there's some things popped, but it's not enjoyable. The entire way through for it to sit in the middle. I would not feel the need to watch it again or to really show other people. I mean, maybe if you got some friends over and you want to watch this type of it definitely should be in the rotation if you're sampling, this kind of era of B-movie anti-communism. But beyond that,
play it back to back with Rambo 2 or 3 though, and I don't think this stacks up.
No.
Especially on a writing or a dramatic level, which is not even something I'd argue that the Rambo movies are particularly great at. It's just Stallone isn't, he was a better performer around the time that he did those movies. He's working with George Cosmatos, who's he was doing some unparalleled fucking shit in that second Rambo film, which we covered a long time ago.
Yeah.
But there's nothing in here quite like Stallone firing an explosive arrow and seeing a giant meat puppet literally explode on the other end of the screen.
Yeah.
It doesn't quite hit that level. This is still B movie or even C grade in terms of writing knockoff status.
Sure.
Yeah, they needed to cut 10 minutes off of that desert sequence, especially.
But as a curiosity of a genuinely evil production and produced and basically written by an insane Republican lobbyist. It's definitely a curiosity worth checking out. And it was fun watching the Casino Jack biopic about Jack Abramoff and actually seeing that they did have to address the existence of this movie. He talks multiple times about
because he didn't like how much swearing there was. Apparently, he thought it should have been more cleaned up and like Christian, or well, not Christian, but more like morally presentable to the whole family or something like that.
That's right. And he actually started the Committee for Traditional Jewish Values in Entertainment as a result of him being annoyed that Zito and Savini made it too gruesome and vulgar.
Noah is the current chair of that organization right now these days.
Am I? Interesting.
That's what you told me. Do you just not want that to be public right now because you have so much good work you're doing? I won't bring it
anyway,
up. Anyway,
if anyone wants to take this as the shot and chase it with the Abramoff biopic, you will get a great moment of Kevin Spacey at one point sitting up at a desk surrounded by the sort of indigenous people he was involved with conning and stealing their money for the casinos.
Oh, yeah.
And at one point he stands up in a meeting and goes, "Let's kick some ass," and literally in Dolph voice. So
I think he would also quote The Godfather a lot, apparently, when he was like lobbying people, quote unquote, lobbying people. He was definitely, he was like Ralph Cifaretto in The Sopranos, like quoting Gladiator all the time. He can't help himself.
Yeah. So, but I think that will wrap it up for this week's episode. That was Red Dawn from 1984 and Red Scorpion from 1988. I am glad that we went into the Republican psychosis meets the maximalist 80s macho action film with you boys today.
Yeah, I need to go watch like a Kelly Reichardt movie or something after this.
Do it. But Brendan and Noah, thanks so much, obviously, for joining us. And I know that you've got a big thing to plug. Is there something coming August 25th?
Yeah,
maybe.
Pipeline is a good word to use, actually, for the season. It's coming down the pipeline. August 25th, season 4 of Blowback, which I hope some of your listeners are already fans of. But if they're not, our first season was about the Iraq War. Second season about the Cuban Revolution and the Missile Crisis. Third season last year was about the Korean War. And this year we will be talking about the long war, the saga of Afghanistan from the 1980s, very much the era we were discussing today, and the Soviet invasion all the way up to the withdrawal.
And if you want to listen to the podcast, you can go to blowback.supportingcast.fm. And you can
or just blowback.show if you need a shorter address.
Blowback.show. And if you sign up and subscribe for $25, you get the whole season all at once. And that'll be 20 episodes. And it's
and the
worth
back
it.
catalog ad-free.
Absolutely. Yeah, Brendan's right. You get the seasons 1 through 3, all available on a private RSS link. Just like I'm sure you guys, the listeners of this, listen to Sleazoids. It's really, really, really easy. And it's, how we get to make the show, and you get to listen to the whole thing at once. So do that, please.
We have we have a teaser coming up that's our first foray into animation. So cool. Probably in August, we've worked with the very talented artist Ben Clarkson, and he whipped up a really fun and pretty spooky animation for us. So there's something
we
new
decided we wanted to consider, what would the Blowback take on Meat Spin be like?
Hell yeah, definitely look into that. And speaking also of, Brendan gave us a perfect segue there with animation. We are going to be back in 1 week's time exclusively over on the Patreon doing our first episode on Ralph Bakshi. We're going to be talking about Fritz the Cat from 1972, I believe, as well as his film Wizards from 1977, because we realized other than heavy metal, we have actually not talked much about the adult animation and independent animation craze of the 1970s. And so Ralph Bakshi is kind of considered, one of the biggest figures of that, and also one of the more controversial and vulgar figures of that as well. I actually just got to see a print for a really like a Ralph Bakshi knockoff film called Down and Dirty Duck about a Donald Duck who fucks. So I kind of feel like I'm prepared for Bakshi, who I have only seen like one or two of his films before, and not Fritz the Cat. But I feel like I'm ready for Fritz the Cat, having seen a B-movie Roger Corman produced knockoff of Fritz the Cat, and we're in for a treat. And that's going to set us up for 2 weeks time, where we are actually having our cartoonist friend Branson Reese who selected for his double feature in 2 weeks' time. We're going to be talking Robert Zemeckis' Roger Rabbit and Cool World, directed by Ralph Bakshi, starring Brad Pitt. So we are going to go crazy with the cartoon and animation over the next 2 weeks that you guys can look forward to listen alongside all of your episodes of Blowback, where you were learning about some devastating history. So that being said, I think that will wrap it up for everything this week. Thanks so much for listening, and keep it sleazy.
Keep it sleazy, everybody.